Before the war expands, the system is already under construction, quietly, deliberately, with numbers that don't look dramatic until they begin to align. By the mid-1930s, Nazi Germany is rearming at a pace that strains its own economy. Millions of men pulled into service, factories recalibrated toward weapons production, fuel requirements rising faster than domestic supply can meet them. Steel, oil, manpower, each one measured, stretched, and reassigned. It doesn't explode into war immediately. It builds pressure first. When conflict begins with the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the system appears to function exactly as intended. Around 1,500,000 German troops move with coordination, supported by over 2,000 tanks and more than 1,000 aircraft. Timing holds. Communication flows. Units advance faster than resistance can stabilize. The method works, not because it is flawless, but because it outpaces everything opposing it. Inside one of those early armored vehicles, the experience compresses into motion and noise. The engine vibrates through the hull. The crew listens to radio transmissions layered over static. Orders arrive, are executed, and replaced almost immediately. There's no pause long enough to question direction. Movement becomes the only constant. I remember going through early German operational summaries and noticing how often success is described in minutes and hours, how quickly a position was taken, how rapidly a unit advanced. That emphasis reveals something important. The system depends on speed, not just as an advantage, but as a requirement. Slow it down, and everything begins to strain. By 1940, that strain isn't visible yet. During the Battle of France, over 3 million German troops push west, bypassing strong defenses and forcing a rapid collapse. The advance reaches the Channel in weeks. It looks decisive. It feels controlled. But expansion brings weight. More territory means longer supply lines. More movement means more fuel burned, hundreds of tons per day for armored divisions alone. And fuel is limited. Germany doesn't produce enough oil domestically. It relies on external sources and synthetic production that cannot fully meet demand. That imbalance sits beneath every success, waiting. Then the system stretches too far. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins, over 3 million troops moving east, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. The first phase mirrors earlier victories, rapid advances, encirclements, large numbers of prisoners. But distance begins to erode everything. Supply lines extend across hundreds of miles. Trucks break down. Rail systems don't match. Fuel arrives late or not at all. Inside a stalled vehicle on that front, the shift is immediate. The engine idles, but movement stops. Crews check gauges that read lower than expected. Orders arrive that no longer align with the situation on the ground. The war that depended on speed begins to lose it. What stays with me from studying this phase is how often German reports don't describe defeat directly. They describe shortages, ammunition reduced, fuel delayed, replacement parts unavailable, each line small on its own. Together, they form something larger. Meanwhile, the opposition adapts. The Soviet Union relocates industry eastward, producing tanks like the T-34 in numbers that absorb losses and continue advancing. The United States enters the war and scales production into tens of thousands of aircraft and vehicles, millions of tons of supplies. Germany, fighting across multiple fronts, cannot match that output. Turning points begin to accumulate. At Battle of Stalingrad, over 200,000 German troops are lost. At Battle of Kursk, an offensive designed to regain initiative stalls against prepared defenses. In the West, bombing campaigns begin to fracture industrial production. Factories damaged, fuel supplies reduced, transportation networks disrupted. Inside Germany itself, the effects become visible. Air raids drop thousands of tons of bombs on industrial centers. Production continues, but under strain. Workers operate in damaged facilities. Transport slows. Fuel shortages tighten further. A system built for rapid expansion now struggles to maintain its own operations. By 1944, the pressure converges. The D-Day landings open a Western front. Soviet forces push from the east. German forces attempt a final offensive during the Battle of the Bulge, committing over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks. Initial gains come, but fuel shortages and resistance stall the advance. What begins as movement slows into fragmentation. I kept returning to one realization while piecing this together. The system didn't fail because it stopped working entirely. It failed because it could no longer sustain the conditions it required: speed, coordination, supply. Once those slipped, everything else followed. By 1945, the war closes in. Allied forces advance into Germany from both directions. Cities absorb sustained bombardment. Units fight with reduced strength, limited fuel, and weakening coordination. The structure that once expanded rapidly now contracts under pressure it cannot absorb. If you're settling into this now, don't try to hold the entire system in your mind. Let it break into smaller parts. The early movement, the expansion, the strain, the slowing. You don't need to resolve every piece tonight. Let it quiet down. Engines cooling, maps no longer shifting, orders fading into distance. You can rest there. This is the entire history of Nazi Germany in World War II. Chapter 1: The Inheritance of Ruin. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from reading economic documents from 1923 Germany. Not the dramatic exhaustion of battle histories or survivor memoirs. Something quieter and more disorienting, like watching a machine dismantle itself in slow motion, with no one quite willing to pull the brake. By November of that year, $1 would buy you 4,210,000,000,000 German marks. Read that number again. 4,210,000,000,000. The Reichsbank's printing presses were running around the clock, and the currency was still losing value faster than the ink could dry. A loaf of bread that had cost a little over half a mark in 1918 had become, by the peak of the crisis, German exercise in bringing a wheelbarrow to the bakery. This wasn't an abstraction for German workers. This was Tuesday. To understand how Adolf Hitler came to lead one of the most catastrophically destructive governments in the history of modern civilization, you have to start not with the man himself, but with the ruins he inherited. And to be more precise, the ruins that others built and that he learned to stand on. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June, 1919, imposed a reparations figure on Germany of 132 billion gold marks. That is not a misprint. 132 billion. Germany's last payment on this debt. Not the full amount, which was never realistic, but the final structured tranche of reparation bonds, was made on the 3rd of October, 2010. That's right. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Germany was still paying for the First World War. When the Berlin Wall fell, Germany was still paying for the First World War. That single fact tells you something important about the political environment into which National Socialism was born. A country that had been told, in legal language, with international signatures attached, that it owed the world a debt that would outlast most people alive when it was signed. The reparations alone didn't cause the hyperinflation. That particular disaster had older, more domestic roots. Germany had financed the First World War not through taxation, which would have been politically painful, but through government borrowing, essentially printing money against expected future victory. When that victory didn't come, the debt remained. Prices doubled between 1914 and 1919, and the Reichsbank, rather than raise taxes on a population already furious with its government, kept printing. Between December of 1921 and July of 1922 alone, the amount of domestic bills and checks held by the Reichsbank rose by 616%. That's not a gradual erosion. That's a cliff. What followed through 1923 was the predictable mathematics of a feedback loop. Prices rise, workers demand higher wages. Businesses raise prices to compensate. The government prints more money to pay its own bills, and the currency becomes, in any practical sense, theatre. Not money, theatre. The crisis ended only in November of 1923, when the government introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by gold, but by a lien on agricultural land and industrial property, and told Germans that the old marks were finished. 400 billion of the old marks would buy you one of the new ones. For a country that had just watched its savings vaporize, that kind of institutional betrayal doesn't fade quickly from memory. The beer hall putsch of the 8th and 9th of November 1923 happened at the precise peak of this chaos. Hitler and a group of armed followers attempted to seize power in Munich in a manner that was, by almost any operational measure, poorly planned and swiftly crushed. 16 of his followers died. Hitler himself was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, of which he would serve less than 9 months. What the failed coup actually accomplished was something far more useful to him than power: a platform. His trial gave him a national stage. His subsequent imprisonment gave him time to dictate what would become the first volume of Mein Kampf, published in 1925. And here is a detail that resists the later mythology. In its first year of publication, Mein Kampf sold fewer than 10,000 copies. By the early 1930s, annual sales were still modest by commercial standards. The German public largely voted for a man whose stated ideology, laid out in considerable detail across several hundred pages of dense prose they had not read, that is not a footnote. That is a warning about how political movements actually spread, not through the careful reading of manifestos, but through the lived experience of hunger and humiliation. The Great Depression arrived in Germany with particular force. By 1932, industrial output had fallen to roughly 58% of its 1928 levels. The unemployment figures for that year are disputed among historians in a way that is itself revealing. The Nazi propaganda apparatus claimed 6 million unemployed. The Weimar Statistical Office registered approximately 5.6 million. And historian Richard Evans has argued the real figure swelled beyond 8 million, once you counted those who had simply stopped registering as job seekers because there was no point. The range between 5.6 and 8 million isn't just statistical imprecision. It's a portrait of institutional collapse, when the mechanisms for counting the suffering break down alongside the mechanisms for alleviating it. What is not in dispute is the electoral consequence. In the Reichstag elections of the 14th of September, 1930, the Nazi Party jumped from 12 seats to 107, one election, 12 to 107, and the sharpest gains weren't in the industrial working class districts where you might expect revolutionary politics to find purchase. The data from the Reichstag Wahlstatistik shows the most dramatic shifts in rural Protestant communities, with collapsing agricultural prices. These weren't the dispossessed urban proletariat of Marxist theory. These were people who had believed in respectable institutions, watched those institutions fail them, and were now ready for something else. On the 30th of January, 1933, Reich President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. It wasn't a coup. No army moved. No constitution was suspended. A man who had served prison time for attempting a putsch against the German state was invited, through entirely legal and democratic procedure, to lead it. Hindenburg's private diary entry for that date has been quoted by biographers, though the exact wording remains contested between accounts. The sentiment consistently relayed in secondary sources is one of resigned political calculation from an aging president who believed he could control a man he privately held in contempt. He couldn't. Almost no one who believed that in early 1933 survived the calculation intact. What I keep returning to when I go through this period is the arithmetic of desperation. Not just economic desperation, though that was real enough, but the deeper desperation of a society that had seen its currency become worthless, its veterans humiliated, its democratic institutions produce nothing but paralysis, and its young men queue for food in a country that, 15 years earlier, had considered itself a great European power. Hitler didn't create that desperation. He found it, named it, and offered it a direction. The direction was catastrophic, but the desperation was entirely real, and it was built not by one man, but by the accumulated failures of a decade. The punishing arithmetic of Versailles, and the reckless monetary policy of the Reichsbank, the inadequacy of democratic institutions to respond to crisis at the speed crisis required. That is the inheritance, not a nation of monsters. A nation of desperate and exhausted people, handed a vessel for their fury by a man who understood, with cold precision, exactly how to fill it. The Rentenmark stabilization of late 1923 did eventually work. By 1924, inflation was under control, and by the late 20s, Germany had entered a period of relative stability. Foreign loans, particularly American ones through the Dawes Plan, helped restructure the economy. Industrial output recovered. For a few years, it looked as though Weimar might survive. Then the American stock market collapsed in October of 1929. The American loans were called in, and the entire fragile recovery unwound within 2 years. The timing was almost surgically precise in its political consequences. Weimar had just barely stabilized when the floor was pulled out again. And this time, the population's patience, already stretched to breaking by the earlier crisis, simply gave way. The moderate parties that had managed the recovery got the blame for the new collapse. The extremists, who had been waiting at the margins, stepped into the center. Germany went to the polls for the last free parliamentary election it would hold for more than a decade in November of 1932. The Nazis actually lost seats in that election. Their vote share dropped from 37% in July to 33% in November, a fact almost never mentioned in popular accounts, because it complicates the story. The trajectory wasn't smoothly upward. There was a moment in the autumn of 1932 when the Nazi surge appeared to be cresting. Hitler was appointed Chancellor, not at the peak of a democratic mandate, but during a dip by a conservative establishment that thought it could use him as a vehicle and then manage him. Every man who signed off on that calculation was wrong. The country that Hitler inherited in January of 1933 was not yet the Third Reich. It was still, legally, the Weimar Republic, battered, divided, economically wounded, but possessed of a constitution, a free press, an independent judiciary, trade unions, and opposition parties. All of those things would be gone within roughly 5 months, not dissolved by tanks, dissolved by paperwork, by law, by the extraordinary efficiency of a government that understood that the most durable power is the kind that presents itself as legitimate. The story of how that happened is the story of the next chapter. And it is, in its own way, even more unsettling than the economic collapse that preceded it. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Control. 100 Days That Remade a Nation. On the 23rd of March, 1933, the German Reichstag voted on a piece of legislation called, with spectacular bureaucratic blandness, the Law for Removing the Distress of the People and the Reich. 441 members voted in favor. 94 voted against. Every one of those 94 was a social democrat. No communist voted. Their deputies had already been arrested or driven into hiding following the Reichstag fire the previous month. The Catholic Centre Party, the Conservatives, the Nationalists all voted yes, and with that vote, the Reichstag effectively made itself redundant. The Enabling Act, as it's known to history, transferred legislative power directly to the government, meaning Hitler could now make law by decree, without parliamentary approval, for 4 years. Within those 4 years, he would make the arrangement permanent. What I find most striking about the stenographic record of that session is not the vote itself, but the speech that preceded it. Otto Wels, the leader of the Social Democrats, rose to explain why his party would not support the act. He was speaking in a chamber where uniformed SA men were positioned in the galleries and corridors, an arrangement that was not subtle. According to the record of that session, the Stenographische Berichte des Reichstags, which survives, Wels told the assembled body that the Social Democrats had given the German people the foundations of democracy, and that they could not, in conscience, vote to dismantle those foundations. He is recorded as saying that you could take their freedom and their lives, but not their honor. Hitler's response, also on the record, was contemptuous, and notably, the contempt was now expressed from a position of power rather than opposition. The days of needing to win arguments were effectively over after that vote. The Reichstag would continue to exist, technically, for the duration of the Third Reich. It met increasingly rarely to applaud decisions already made. It had voted itself into theatre. The weeks between Hitler's appointment on the 30th of January and the Enabling Act vote on the 23rd of March were not wasted. The speed of what happened in those 53 days is one of the period's most important and least appreciated facts. The Reichstag fire on the 27th of February, 1933, gave the regime its first major instrument. The emergency decree signed by Hindenburg the very next day, suspending civil liberties protections and allowing protective custody arrests without judicial review. Marinus van der Lubbe, a young Dutch communist, was found in the burning building and arrested. He was later executed. The question of whether he acted alone or was used by the Nazi apparatus remains genuinely unresolved among historians. Fritz Tobias, in his 1962 investigation, concluded van der Lubbe had acted alone. Hans Mommsen and other historians have argued the structural evidence points toward at least Nazi exploitation of, if not involvement in, the fire. What is unambiguous, and this is the part that matters for this story, is that pre-drafted emergency legislation appeared with remarkable speed the morning after the fire. Legislation of that scope doesn't get drafted overnight. It existed before the fire. The fire provided the occasion. Between February and July of 1933, the Nazi government issued approximately 42 major pieces of legislation reshaping German society. That averages to roughly one civilization-altering law every 4 to 5 days. The Gleichschaltung, the coordination or synchronization process, was a legal mechanism by which independent institutions were either forcibly dissolved, absorbed into Nazi-controlled structures, or pressured into self-dissolution. The German Trade Union Federation had approximately 4.5 million members in early 1933. It had operated for decades, representing workers across the country. On the 2nd of May, 1933, a single day, its offices were raided by SA and SS units. Its leaders were arrested, its funds were seized and transferred to the new Deutsche Arbeitsfront, the Nazi labor organization. The entire operation was completed in one day. The Federation's 4.5 million members had no federation by nightfall. Political parties followed the same trajectory. The Communist Party was effectively banned by the emergency decree following the Reichstag fire. The Social Democrats were formally prohibited in June of 1933. The remaining parties, the Catholic Centre, the Conservatives, the Nationalists, were either pressured into self-dissolution or saw their leaders accept that formal resistance was now too dangerous. On the 14th of July, 1933, a law was passed making the formation of any new political party illegal. Germany was officially a one-party state. 6 months after Hitler's appointment, no coup, no civil war. A cascade of legislation, each piece building on the institutional damage created by the previous one, and executed at a pace that left no time for organized resistance to coalesce. The Night of the Long Knives, in late June of 1934, completed a different kind of consolidation. The SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Brown Shirts, the paramilitary force that had helped bring the Nazis to power, had grown to several million members under Ernst Röhm, and Röhm had his own ideas about the revolution's next phase. He envisioned the SA absorbing the traditional army, positioning himself as the leader of a genuinely revolutionary military force. The regular army, the Reichswehr, was deeply hostile to this prospect. So, evidently, was Hitler, who had his own reasons, political and personal, for deciding that Röhm's power had grown inconvenient. Between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July, 1934, JSS and Gestapo units arrested and executed SA leadership figures across Germany. At least 85 people were killed in the purge, though historians have noted estimates ranging from several hundred to perhaps 1,000. The actual death toll was never formally accounted for, which was itself a statement of what the rule of law now meant. Röhm was killed in his prison cell. So were others who had nothing to do with the SA. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, for instance, who had made enemies. The German cabinet subsequently passed a law retroactively declaring the killings legal as acts of state self-defense. The courts did not object. There were no longer courts, in any meaningful sense, that could. Here is a fact that deserves to sit in silence for a moment. Hitler never held a direct popular vote to become Chancellor. The closest thing to a mandate was the August 1934 plebiscite, asking German citizens to approve the merger of the offices of Chancellor and President, a merger that had already occurred when Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August. Germans were asked to approve something that had already happened. Even that vote, conducted after the fact, returned a figure of roughly 89% in favour, impressive, but conducted in a country where the machinery of intimidation was already fully operational, and there was no independent press to complicate the question. These are the mechanics of what might be called democratic theatre, the forms of popular legitimacy hollowed out and preserved as performance. Germany had elections. They had results. The results ratified what had already been decided. The press was not exempt from Gleichschaltung, and its transformation was perhaps the most consequential single institutional change of the period. The Schriftleitergesetz, the editor's law, of October 1933, made individual editors personally legally responsible for any content that harmed the interests of the state. The effect was instantaneous and comprehensive self-censorship. You didn't need a censor in every newsroom when you'd made every editor personally liable for what appeared on the page. By 1934, Germany's newspapers were publishing a version of reality, substantially constructed by Goebbels's propaganda ministry. This wasn't just about suppressing dissent. It was about replacing the shared factual ground on which political argument depends. When a population is receiving a systematically manufactured version of events, the capacity for collective political judgment, already strained by economic crisis, erodes in ways that are difficult to reverse quickly. Reading through this period in sequence, the thing that genuinely unsettles me isn't the evil of it, it's the efficiency, the bureaucratic smoothness. Each institution fell, not because tanks surrounded it, but because a law arrived, or an arrest was made, or a form was required that only the approved organization could issue. This is how totalitarianism actually works in its construction phase. Not as a dramatic seizure, but as an administrative suffocation. And the people administering it were, in many cases, not fanatics. They were civil servants, lawyers, judges, editors, trade association chairmen, professionals who told themselves they were navigating difficult circumstances, that things would stabilize, that the excesses would moderate. Most of them were wrong. Some of them knew they were wrong and said nothing. The stenographic record of the Reichstag on the 23rd of March, 1933, is full of men who knew exactly what they were voting for and voted for it anyway, for reasons that seemed, in the moment, to be practical. By the end of 1933, the Third Reich had been legally constituted from materials that the Weimar Republic had itself provided. The emergency decree powers, the enabling legislation, the laws governing associations, none of these were invented from nothing. They were adaptations of existing legal frameworks, which stretched beyond their intended limits by men who understood that constitutional language is only as strong as the institutions willing to enforce it, and who had systematically disabled every institution capable of enforcement. There's a moment in October of 1933 when Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the World Disarmament Conference, a signal to the international community that the new government did not consider itself bound by the cooperative frameworks of the Weimar period. Britain and France issued diplomatic protests. Nothing else happened. That nothing was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential events of the decade. What remained of the old Germany, the Germany of Weimar's courts, its free press, its trade unions, its opposition parties, had been legally dismantled in under 12 months. What replaced it was a state that retained the vocabulary of law and governance while evacuating its substance. The Reichstag still met. Courts still heard cases. Newspapers still published. But the Reichstag applauded on cue. The courts handed down the verdicts the regime required, and the newspapers printed what Goebbels's ministry provided. This is the architecture of control at its most sophisticated. Not the crude suppression of form, but the careful corruption of content, until every institution that people trusted as a check on power had become an instrument of the power it was supposed to check. Building that architecture took roughly 100 days. Dismantling it would take 12 years, a world war, and somewhere between 70 and 80 million dead. Chapter 3. Kristallnacht. One night's invoice. There is a billing document that survives from the autumn of 1938. It is not a document from a police report or a military operation. It is a commercial invoice, formatted in its basic structure, identically to any standard civilian passenger transport tariff you might have found in a German railway office at the time. It charges per person, per kilometre, for one-way transport to the east. Children under 4 years old travel free. Children between 4 and 10 travel at half price. This document was not issued during the war. It was issued for deportation transports in 1942. But its roots, its bureaucratic logic, its administrative vocabulary, its comfortable indifference to what the transaction actually represented, were established in the weeks following the 9th of November, 1938. You can't understand what came later without understanding what was established that night. The principle that the destruction of a community could be organized, invoiced, and filed. The pretext arrived in Paris. A 17-year-old Polish Jewish boy named Herschel Grinspan walked into the German embassy on the 7th of November, 1938, and shot a diplomat named Ernst von Rath. Grinspan's family had been among approximately 17,000 Jews of Polish citizenship expelled from Germany the previous month, deported to a no-man's land on the Polish border, where Polish authorities refused to accept them. His parents were among the stranded. Von Rath died 2 days later, on the 9th of November, and the Nazi leadership gathered in Munich for the annual commemoration of the 1923 putsch, received the news and made a decision. What followed was presented to the world as a spontaneous eruption of public grief and anger. It was not. A Gestapo telex issued just before midnight on the 9th of November, signed under the authority of Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, and coordinated through Reinhard Heydrich's office, transmitted instructions to police stations across Germany. The instructions were, in their own way, a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. They specified what should happen, and critically, what should be protected, non-Jewish property. The instructions treated the upcoming violence as a logistical matter to be properly supervised, not suppressed. The night of the 9th and 10th of November, 1938, became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, for what it left behind on German streets. Approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed. Somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 synagogues were burned, depending on which accounting you use. The numbers still vary between sources. The official Nazi figure for Jews killed that night, and in its immediate aftermath, was 91. The historian Arno Lustiger, working from regional records in research published around the year 2000, arrived at a substantially higher figure, approximately 1,300 killed when you include the days following the pogrom. The discrepancy isn't bureaucratic imprecision, it's deliberate. The Nazi regime kept the official count low for international consumption, while internally the violence was understood and approved at the highest levels. The lower figure remains in many standard accounts. The higher figure is what the evidence supports. Within 48 hours of the pogrom, approximately 30,000 Jewish men had been arrested and sent to concentration camps. Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. This was the first mass deportation. It is worth saying that, plainly, the first organized mass removal of Jewish citizens to concentration camps happened in the weeks following Kristallnacht in November of 1938. The camps released most of these men over the following weeks and months on the condition that they immediately emigrate from Germany and sign over their property as the price of release. Emigration required money. Their property had been seized. The circle was tight and deliberate. On the 12th of November, 1938, 3 days after the pogrom, Hermann Göring chaired a meeting of senior Nazi officials and insurance industry representatives to discuss the financial aftermath. The meeting transcript survived and was used as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. What it records is extraordinary. A room full of powerful men discussing, with evident practicality, the question of who would pay for all the damage. Jewish property owners would receive no insurance payouts. The companies were relieved of that obligation by state decree. The Jewish community as a whole was instead fined 1 billion Reichsmarks as collective punishment for the violence done to them. 1 billion Reichsmarks. Göring is recorded in the transcript making remarks that struck those present as humorous. This was a man who had just supervised a nationwide pogrom, discussing its financial accounting as though it were an inconvenient but manageable business problem. The transcript shows him using the German phrase for "what a mess" at one point, in apparent reference to the cleanup logistics. The glass alone, the actual broken window glass from approximately 7,500 destroyed Jewish-owned businesses, amounted to a quantity so large that Germany had to import replacement plate glass from Belgium. A Reichsbank economic report from November 1938, examining the costs, noted the pogrom had created a net foreign currency deficit. The damage inflicted on Jewish property had made Germany materially poorer by requiring foreign exchange to replace the shattered glass. The economic logic of the persecution had, in this instance, worked directly against the interests of the German economy. This was noted. It was not reconsidered. The priorities of the regime were not, in the final analysis, economic. The process of Arisierung, Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses to German owners at a fraction of their market value, had actually been underway since 1933. By November of 1938, well over half of all Jewish-owned businesses in Germany had already been transferred. Kristallnacht didn't begin this process. It accelerated the remainder, creating a final push to strip Jewish economic life from Germany in the months that followed. The tools were administrative, forms to be filed, valuations to be conducted, transfer certificates to be obtained. The people who processed these transfers, the notaries, the estate agents, the municipal officials, were performing routine professional functions that happened to constitute the organized theft of a community's economic existence. Most of them were never held accountable for this. Most of them simply continued their professional lives after 1945. The date itself, the 9th of November, was not chosen by chance. In the Nazi calendar, November 9th was already loaded. It was the anniversary of the 1918 armistice, the moment of Germany's defeat in the First World War, and, in Nazi ideology, the stab in the back. It was also the anniversary of the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, the party's founding martyrdom. Choosing this date for the pogrom was a deliberate act of calendar weaponization, folding the destruction of Jewish property into the mythology of national grievance and party heroism. The victims of the night were being murdered, arrested, and dispossessed on a date that had been officially sanctified as a symbol of Germany's humiliation and eventual triumph. That deliberate staging is important. It means this wasn't spontaneous. It was choreographed, including its place in the official mythology. The international response to Kristallnacht was largely one of protest and diplomatic condemnation. The United States recalled its ambassador from Berlin. Several countries formally objected. Jewish refugee organizations intensified their efforts to accelerate emigration. None of this produced a material change in Nazi policy. If anything, the modest international response reinforced a lesson the regime had been absorbing since the occupation of the Rhineland in 1936, that the democracies would express dismay and then accommodate. This calculation would drive German foreign policy for another year, until the invasion of Poland finally produced a declaration of war from Britain and France, a response that appeared to genuinely surprise Hitler, who had expected another accommodation. What Kristallnacht established, looking at it from the distance of 87 years, was a threshold, not just in the sense that it marked an escalation of state-sanctioned violence, though it did. More specifically, it established the operational and bureaucratic precedents for what would follow. The mass arrest and deportation of Jewish citizens, the systematic stripping of property, the coordination between SS security forces, the regular police, and civilian administrative machinery. The concentration camps had absorbed 30,000 men within days and then processed their release or continued detention through documented bureaucratic channels. The insurance industry had been conscripted into the system. The railway authorities had been put on notice that they might be required. None of this was accidental. All of it was filed. Chapter 4, Blitzkrieg, the spreadsheet behind the lightning. Let's start with a fuel requisition, not a speech, not a parade. A fuel requisition dated somewhere in May of 1940, from the advance elements of Guderian's Panzer Group, crossing into France through the Ardennes. The document records how many cubic meters of diesel were allocated for the push and, more interestingly, the growing shortfall already building in the supply chain. Germany was winning the most dramatic military campaign Europe had seen since Napoleon, and it was already running low on diesel. The victory at Sedan, the breakthrough that cracked the Allied front in half and made everything else that followed possible in that extraordinary 6-week campaign, was being won on borrowed fuel. That detail doesn't diminish what happened. It complicates the story in ways that actually make it more interesting. Because the German victory in France in 1940 was not the product of overwhelming industrial might or doctrinal certainty. It was the product of a narrow window of opportunity, a specific set of circumstances, and a decision to accept tactical risk that the Allied command structure couldn't match in speed or flexibility. The campaign opened on the 10th of May, 1940, when German forces moved simultaneously into France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The Allied response was immediate and, in its own terms, logical. French and British forces moved north into Belgium to meet what they correctly identified as one arm of the German advance. What they missed, fatally, was the other arm. The Sichelschnitt plan, the sickle cut, sent 7 panzer divisions through the Ardennes forest, terrain that French military planning had assessed as essentially impassable for armoured vehicles. The French assessment was not unreasonable. The Ardennes is hilly, heavily wooded terrain, with narrow roads, and moving armoured columns through it required extraordinary traffic management and a willingness to accept that the entire force would be vulnerable and strung out for days. OKH planners had initially considered the plan too risky. Erich von Manstein, who had championed the concept, had been removed from his planning post partly for pressing it too aggressively. Hitler, in one of the rare instances where his operational instincts aligned with genuine military innovation rather than catastrophic overreach, embraced the plan when he encountered it. By the time the campaign launched, the Ardennes option was the main effort, and the French had no idea. Here's something that almost never makes it into the popular story of France 1940. The French had more tanks than Germany. Not slightly more. 3,254 French and Allied armoured vehicles against approximately 2,439 German. Many French tank types were technically superior in armour protection to their German counterparts. The Char B-1 heavy tank carried armour thick enough to defeat most German anti-tank weapons at standard combat ranges. The Saumur S-35 was considered by many military assessors at the time to be the best medium tank in any European army. Germany's victory wasn't won by superior hardware. It was won by communications, specifically by the fact that German tanks had radios, while most French tanks communicated by flag or direct order. It was won by command culture. German commanders at every level were empowered to make decisions without waiting for authorization from above, while French doctrine emphasized centralized control and deliberate operation. And it was won by speed. Not just physical speed, though German armored columns moved faster than French logistics could track, but decision speed, the gap between when something happened and when the French chain of command understood it had happened and issued a response, was simply too wide to survive. The Maybach HL-120 engine, powering the Panzer III and IV, produced 300 horsepower from a 12-cylinder block, adequate for road speeds of around 40 kilometers per hour, but constrained in cross-country range to roughly 130 to 160 kilometers before refueling was required. This sounds like a mundane technical detail. It isn't. For every panzer brigade that advanced, a dedicated fuel column had to move forward 50,000 litres of diesel, roughly every 24 to 36 hours under combat conditions. The logistics chain wasn't a supporting element of the blitzkrieg. It was the blitzkrieg, or rather, its limiting factor. The operational art of the German advance in France was, at its most fundamental level, the art of keeping armoured spearheads moving faster than their own supply lines, and faster than the enemy could react to fill the gaps those spearheads created. That worked brilliantly, briefly, in France, where the distances were manageable and the campaign was swift. It would not work in Russia. The Dunkirk halt order of the 24th of May is one of the most examined command decisions in military history, and it remains genuinely contested. When German armoured forces were within reach of the beaches, where 338,000 Allied troops were assembling for evacuation, they stopped. Why? Hitler's order is documented. But the question of who actually initiated the halt, whether it originated with Hitler or with Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who was concerned about the state of his armour after weeks of hard campaigning, is answered differently depending on which primary source you consult. Guderian's post-war memoir, the OKH War Diary, and Rundstedt's own subsequent account don't fully agree. Goering's promise to finish the evacuation from the air is documented in meeting records, as is the Luftwaffe's inability to deliver on that promise. The sortie rates simply didn't support the operational claim. 338,000 men escaped from Dunkirk between the 26th of May and the 4th of June. Every account of why they escaped assigns the responsibility somewhere different. The truth is, probably, that it was a convergence of factors, and that certainty about primary causation is something the historical record doesn't actually provide. France formally surrendered on the 22nd of June 1940. The armistice was signed not in a neutral location, but in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, in which Germany had accepted the armistice terms ending the First World War in November of 1918. That carriage had been preserved in a museum. Getting it to Compiègne required logistical effort. It was physically moved from the museum to its 1918 position in the forest clearing. Hitler stood on the spot where Germany had signed its own humiliation 22 years earlier and received France's capitulation in the same seat, in the same carriage, in the same clearing. The staging is documented in OKW administrative records. Then the carriage was destroyed. It was later burned, apparently on Hitler's orders, to prevent it ever being used for another such ceremony. The symbolism was total. The gesture was complete. And Western Europe, from Norway to the Pyrenees, was under German control or German influence. The campaign in France consumed approximately 1.1 million tons of fuel. Germany's pre-war stockpiles and production capacity, while substantial, were not limitless, and the burn rate of an intensive armoured campaign was extraordinary. The speed of the French collapse actually prevented a fuel crisis that would have ended the campaign prematurely if it had dragged on for months rather than weeks. There's an uncomfortable irony buried in the German blitzkrieg victories. They worked partly because they worked so fast. The very speed that made them seem invincible was also the thing that masked their logistical fragility. 6 weeks in France was sustainable. 12 weeks would have raised serious questions. The Eastern Front, which would eventually stretch to hundreds of weeks, was a different mathematical reality entirely. What I find genuinely fascinating about the Blitzkrieg mythology, and it is partly mythology, is that the German military didn't have a fully articulated doctrine called Blitzkrieg in 1939. The term itself was largely coined and popularized by foreign journalists and then retroactively adopted. The Wehrmacht had developed doctrines of combined arms, mobile operations, and decentralized command, what the Germans called Auftragstaktik, mission-based tactics. But the coherent strategic concept of Blitzkrieg as a philosophical system was constructed mainly after the victories in Poland and France, to explain what had happened. That backward construction was dangerous, because when commanders started to believe they had mastered a proven operational system, they applied it to situations where the conditions that had made it work in France, short distances, weak enemy command and control, favorable terrain corridors, did not exist. Russia was not France. It was never going to be France. But the Blitzkrieg victories had produced a kind of institutional confidence in Germany's senior military leadership that the subsequent evidence would need to be quite brutally heavy to overturn. Poland had been the opening act, beginning on the 1st of September 1939. A campaign that was swift but not without German losses, fought against an army that has been unfairly caricatured in popular memory. The story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks is essentially a myth. Polish cavalry units were equipped with anti-tank rifles and generally operated as mobile infantry, and the few incidents of mounted troops encountering armor were rare and often occurred in confused circumstances, not as deliberate tactical doctrine. The Polish army fought hard and was defeated not by its own inadequacy, but by simultaneous invasion from the west by Germany, and from the 17th of September, from the east by the Soviet Union, under the terms of a secret protocol in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed the previous August. The pact itself, a non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, remains one of the most significant diplomatic documents of the 20th century. and one of the most grotesque examples of two ideologically hostile regimes, setting aside their stated beliefs for territorial convenience. By the autumn of 1940, Germany controlled most of Western Europe. What remained undefeated was Britain, protected by the Channel, its air force, and a capacity for institutional stubbornness that had not yet been fully tested. Hitler's attempt to subdue Britain from the air, the Battle of Britain, fought from July through October of 1940, had failed. The Luftwaffe had not achieved the air superiority required to support a cross-channel invasion, and the invasion plan, Operation Sea Lion, was effectively shelved. Germany was not done with the West, but it couldn't finish it. And Hitler's gaze had already turned east, to the country that had always been, in his stated ideology and in the long record of his private statements, the primary objective. The real war, the one in Mein Kampf, the one about Lebensraum, and the destruction of what he called Judeo-Bolshevism, hadn't started yet. Everything up to this point had been, in Hitler's conception, the clearing of the strategic table before the main event. Chapter 5. A single letter from Smolensk. There is a letter, or rather, there are tens of thousands of letters, sitting in archives in Germany that almost no documentary has bothered to spend real time with. Not official correspondence. Not orders or reports or intelligence assessments. Letters home. The Feldpost, the Wehrmacht's military postal service, handled more than 40 million letters and packages a month by 1942. 40 million a month. That's not a logistics footnote. That's one of the most intimate mass archives in modern history. The daily emotional record of several million men, written under conditions that ranged from routine boredom to extreme fear, filtered through self-censorship and the knowledge that letters were occasionally screened and sent home to mothers, wives, fathers, and children who were being told by the official press that the war in the East was proceeding magnificently. The summer of 1941 was different from France. Every soldier who had been through the Western campaigns seems to have understood this fairly quickly. The distances were different. The roads were different. Russian roads in many sectors were not roads in any Western sense, just rutted dirt tracks that turned to boot-sucking mud in the rain, and iron-hard frozen channels in the cold. The landscape was different in ways that were hard to articulate. The fighting was different. France had been, for German soldiers, a fast-moving, largely successful campaign that lasted 6 weeks and deposited them in Paris for a victory parade. The East didn't have an endpoint visible from the beginning. The horizon just kept receding. What the letters reveal, and this is where the historian Sönke Neitzel's work with the Feldpost archives becomes genuinely valuable, is not a monolith of ideology. The range of what German soldiers expressed in their letters home is complex in ways that resist simple characterization. Some letters are explicitly ideological, framing the campaign in the terms of Nazi racial doctrine. Others are almost entirely personal. The weather, the food, the longing for home, the particular way the light falls across a specific field that reminds the writer of somewhere back in Germany. Many are both, sometimes within the same paragraph. A man who has clearly absorbed the regime's language about the East coexisting with a man who just wants his mother to know he's alive and that the cherry tree was beautiful when he last saw it. That coexistence is, in its way, the most disturbing thing about these letters. These weren't men choosing between humanity and ideology as distinct options. They were navigating both simultaneously, often without apparent awareness of the tension. The Soldaten Project, Neitzel and Harold Welzer's analysis of secretly recorded conversations between German prisoners of war, provides a counterpoint to the letters that is uncomfortable in specific and important ways. The conversations, recorded covertly by British and American intelligence services, were not filtered by self-censorship. Men said things to each other in those recordings that they would never have put in a letter home. The gap between what soldiers wrote to their families and what they said to fellow prisoners, particularly around the question of what they had witnessed or participated in on the Eastern Front, is a significant archival fault line. The letters tend towards silence or euphemism on certain subjects. The conversations do not. This discrepancy doesn't mean the letters are worthless as sources. It means they have to be read as a particular kind of document, shaped by the relationship between writer and recipient, by the social and family expectations of that relationship, and by the soldier's own need to manage how he was seen by the people who mattered most to him. Cross-referencing letters with unit war diaries is one of the more revealing exercises in this kind of research. The war diaries are operational. They record movements, engagements, casualties, supply states. They document what units did and where. What you find doing this kind of cross-reference is silence. Events that are clearly recorded in the operational documentation. Things that happened within the operational area of a given unit, that produce no corresponding mention in any of the letters home from that period. Not a brief mention, not an oblique reference, not even the kind of circumspect language that soldiers sometimes used when they wanted to say something without saying it. Just absence. The silence is a primary source in its own right. There is a small collection in the Bundesarchive of a particular kind of letter. Letters found on the bodies of soldiers who died before they could post them. These are among the most peculiar documents the war produced. They were written to be read by one person, a wife, a mother, a friend, and instead were read by whoever processed the personal effects of the dead, and then eventually archived, where they remain available to researchers. Some are mundane, the kind of letter anyone might write on any afternoon, that became something else by the accident of the writer's death before it could be sent. Others contain things that were written in the confidence they would be read only by one trusted pair of eyes, and that have now been read by strangers across decades. There's a specific ethical weight to handling these documents, which professional researchers acknowledge and which I don't think general documentary treatments spend enough time with. The Wehrmacht's postal censors, and there were censors, operated not by reading individual letters, but by statistical sampling. Approximately 1 in every 2,000 letters was read and analysed, and the results were compiled into monthly mood reports, Stimmungsberichte, that went directly to the OKW. Some of these reports survived and are held in the Bundesarchive. They function as something extraordinary, a near real-time aggregated morale index for an entire army, conducted by the army's own surveillance apparatus, designed to give the high command an honest picture of what its soldiers were actually thinking. The reports from the autumn and winter of 1941 are notably different in character from those of the summer. The summer reports record confidence, even excitement, from soldiers caught up in the pace of the initial advance. The autumn and winter reports begin to record something different, a rising register of uncertainty, exhaustion, and, in phrases that appear with increasing frequency, something approaching confusion about what they were fighting for and when it might end. One phrase appears in multiple letters from this period, flagged in at least some of the censor's analyses. Es war kein richtiger Krieg mehr. It was no longer a proper war. German soldiers were using their own vocabulary to try to describe something they were experiencing but hadn't been given language for. A proper war, a clean war, a war with defined engagements and proportionate violence, a war that looked like the campaigns in Poland and France, was what they had signed up for, or at least what they had been prepared to understand. The Eastern Front in the autumn of 1941 was becoming something else. The phrase is not an admission or a confession. It's a soldier reaching for a distinction between categories of experience and finding that the categories are insufficient for what he's been asked to do. I want to be honest about what extended time with these letters does to a researcher. It's not comfortable, not because they're full of horror, many of them aren't, but because of the ordinariness they preserve. Men asking whether the family dog is well. Men asking about the harvest, the football results, the health of a neighbor. Men expressing love and worry and boredom in language that is entirely recognizable across 80 years. The ordinariness is the point. It makes the question of how these same men participated in what was happening around them not just historically interesting, but genuinely disorienting. The academic literature on moral disengagement, the psychological mechanisms through which people participate in institutional harm while maintaining a coherent self-image, was developed partly by studying exactly this population, this period. Albert Bandura's work on the subject is now influential in fields ranging from military ethics to organizational psychology. It draws on evidence from this exact archive. The letters were, in a sense, the original research material for understanding how ordinary people do terrible things without, in their own minds, becoming terrible people. The Feldpost system itself was an extraordinary piece of logistics, and in another war, it might be celebrated simply as an administrative achievement. 11 billion pieces of mail in 1944 alone, 11 billion, processed, transported, and delivered by a military postal organization operating across fronts spanning thousands of kilometers through conditions that made normal transportation a daily challenge. Letters from men on the Eastern Front routinely reached families in Germany within a week to 10 days. This wasn't incidental to the war effort. The morale function of mail, the connection it maintained between soldiers and their families, the sense that the distance was bridgeable, that home still existed and still knew where you were, was understood by the Wehrmacht's leadership as operationally important. Keeping an army fighting isn't just a question of ammunition and food. It's a question of meaning. The Feldpost was, among other things, the infrastructure of meaning. Chapter 6, Operation Barbarossa, the largest mistake in military history. Before the first German soldier crossed the Soviet border on the 22nd of June, 1941, a document existed in the planning files of the German Army's logistical department that should have changed everything. It was prepared by the staff of General Eduard Wagner, the Wehrmacht's quartermaster general, the man responsible for ensuring that the army could actually supply and sustain the operation it was being asked to conduct. Wagner's pre-operational logistics study, completed before the campaign launched, contained an assessment that was stark in its implications. The Wehrmacht's supply system could sustain the advance to approximately 500 kilometers from the German start line. 500 kilometers. And Moscow lay roughly 900 kilometers from the border. The study was received. It was marked as noted. It was filed. And on the 22nd of June, 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union on the largest military invasion in the history of warfare. The invasion of the Soviet Union was called Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German emperor Frederick Barbarossa. It opened along a front that stretched approximately 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. 3 army groups led the assault. Army Group North driving toward Leningrad, Army Group Center driving toward Moscow, Army Group South driving toward Kiev, and the agricultural and industrial resources of Ukraine. The initial results were, by almost any military measure, staggering. In the first weeks, German armored columns advanced hundreds of kilometers, encircling and capturing entire Soviet armies. The numbers of Soviet prisoners taken in the early encirclements, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, were in the hundreds of thousands. It looked, from the outside, and probably from inside the OKH as well, like France repeated at a larger scale. It wasn't. The first sign was the roads. German planning had assumed a Soviet road network of comparable quality to what the Wehrmacht had encountered in France and the Low Countries. What they found was largely dirt tracks, many of them seasonal, that degraded rapidly under heavy vehicle traffic and became impassable in rain. The maps, and this is a detail that continues to astonish, were in many sectors reprints of Tsarist-era surveys from the 1890s and early 1900s. Roads marked as improved had in many cases reverted to agricultural tracks. Villages shown on the maps no longer existed. The Wehrmacht was navigating a country whose cartographic representation was 50 years out of date in the sectors where it mattered most. German reconnaissance units were, in places, genuinely unsure what terrain they were about to encounter, because the maps were that unreliable. The railway problem was structural and irreversible. The Soviet rail gauge, the distance between rails, measured 1,524 millimeters. The German and European standard gauge measured 1,435 millimeters. Every kilometer of captured Soviet railway required physical regauging before German supply trains could use it. The Reichsbahn deployed more than 7,000 workers specifically for this task, advancing behind the fighting troops and converting track as fast as they could. They couldn't convert it fast enough. By October of 1941, Army Group Center was receiving approximately 70 trains per day, when its operational requirements called for 150. That's less than half of what was needed to sustain offensive operations. And this was in October, before the roads turned to mud, before the temperature dropped, before the full weight of the logistical failure became apparent. In between the panzers and their fuel, between the artillery and its shells, between the infantry and its rations, were the horses. This is the detail that gets left out of almost every popular account of the German war machine, and its omission creates a fundamentally false picture. The Wehrmacht deployed approximately 600,000 horses with Operation Barbarossa. Some sources put the figure slightly higher, to haul artillery, ammunition, and supplies through terrain where motorized transport struggled or failed. 80% of German logistics and transport in the east depended, at various stages, on horse-drawn vehicles. Not armored vehicles, not trucks, horses and wooden wagons. Each working horse required between 10 and 15 kilograms of fodder daily. In a theatre where local fodder supplies were quickly exhausted, and the supply trains were already struggling to move forward the ammunition and food for soldiers, the fodder requirement for hundreds of thousands of horses represented a logistical burden of crushing proportions. When the fodder ran out, and in the winter of 1941 it did, horses died. When horses died, wagons stopped. When wagons stopped, units that had outrun their motorized supply convoys were entirely isolated. The most technologically sophisticated military force in Europe was, in its operational reality, substantially dependent on the same transport technology as the Napoleonic campaigns. The question of the August 1941 diversion, The decision to redirect Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group south toward Kiev, rather than continuing the drive toward Moscow, remains one of the most argued command decisions in military historiography. Hitler's order redirected Germany's most capable armoured formation away from the capital at a moment when some German commanders believed Moscow was within operational reach. The Kiev encirclement that resulted was an extraordinary tactical success. Approximately 650,000 Soviet troops were captured. Then the panzers turned north to resume the Moscow advance, now weeks behind the original schedule, with autumn already tightening into early winter. General Halder's post-war diary assigns the diversion entirely to Hitler's interference against the advice of his generals, but OKH operational orders from the period show Halder himself endorsing the Kiev option in at least some documentation. The post-war Halder is not entirely the same man as the wartime Halder. His papers, like many generals' papers from this period, contain the revisions of a man managing how history would judge him. Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, launched on the 2nd of October, 1941. Initial results were again dramatic. 2 more massive encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk captured hundreds of thousands more Soviet troops. For a brief moment in October, German reconnaissance units were close enough to Moscow that some personnel reportedly saw the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. Then the autumn rains came, and with them what the Russians call the Rasputitsa, the mud season, when the roads dissolved and wheeled vehicles sank to their axles, and even tracked vehicles struggled. The advance slowed to walking pace. Temperatures dropped. Supplies, including winter clothing, cold weather lubricants for weapons and vehicles, insulated gear, had not been stockpiled because the planning assumption had been that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter arrived. A supply convoy documented in the Wehrmacht's quartermaster records from December of 1941 tells a specific story. It was carrying 40,000 winter coats and approximately 18 tons of cold weather engine lubricant, items desperately needed at the front, where soldiers were fighting in summer uniforms at temperatures approaching minus 30 degrees Celsius, and weapons were freezing at the moment of firing. The convoy was stranded far short of its destination because the railway regauging hadn't reached that sector, and the roads were frozen and impassable. The coats and the lubricant didn't arrive before the freeze. The men and the machines that needed them were already at the front. One of the most mechanically sophisticated armies in European history was unable, in December of 1941, to deliver a coat to a soldier in the field. By the 27th of November, 1941, General Wagner, the same quartermaster general whose pre-operational study had warned that the supply system would reach its limit at 500 kilometers, reported to the OKH that the army had reached the end of our human and material strength. This was not a complaint from a junior officer. This was the man responsible for keeping the entire Eastern Front supplied, telling the High Command in plain language that the system had given out. On the 5th and 6th of December, the Red Army launched its winter counteroffensive near Moscow, marshalling forces that German intelligence had failed to detect, reserves that Soviet strategic planning had been carefully husbanding, while the Wehrmacht consumed itself in the advance. Army Group Center began to retreat. For the first time since September of 1939, a German army was moving backward under pressure. The standard popular explanation for Barbarossa's failure. General winter, the Russian weather, is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete. The weather was a factor. It was not the primary cause. The primary cause is sitting in Eduard Wagner's pre-operational logistics study, filed in the planning archives before a single shot was fired. A supply system that couldn't reach Moscow regardless of the weather. Geo-railway network that couldn't be regauged fast enough to close the gap. And a planning culture so oriented toward optimistic outcomes that it treated a documented supply crisis as an inconvenient calculation to be overridden by confidence. The snow that fell on German soldiers in December of 1941 was the final weight on a structure that had been crumbling from its foundation since June. Winter didn't defeat Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht's inability to sustain what it started defeated Barbarossa. Winter just made it undeniable. Chapter 7. The Desk Killers. Bureaucracy and the Final Solution. Start with a billing document, not a battle order, not a speech, a commercial invoice, deformatted in the standard template of the German National Railway's passenger tariff schedule. The same kind of form a booking clerk would process for a family travelling from Berlin to Hamburg for the summer. Except this one charges a per-person, per-kilometre group rate for one-way transport. Children under 4 travel free. Children between 4 and 10 at half fare. The destination, in the bureaucratic shorthand of the document, is listed simply as the East. The document is real. It exists in the archive at Yad Vashem, and it was not created by a monster in any recognizable cinematic sense. It was created by a railway administrator doing his job, processing a booking, filing a copy, and moving on to the next form. This is what the industrialization of genocide actually looked like at the operational level. Not a scream. A tariff schedule. The Holocaust did not begin with the death camps. It began with a process, an incremental, bureaucratically documented process of definition, registration, isolation, expropriation, and eventually destruction, that unfolded over more than a decade and required the willing or passive participation of tens of thousands of ordinary professionals. Lawyers who wrote the racial laws, census officials who administered racial classification, police who enforced deportation orders, railway administrators who processed the transport bookings, bank officials who received and processed the looted assets under a false account name. Each of these participants had a professional role, a chain of command, a desk, and a filing system. What they collectively constituted was a machine for murder, organized along the lines of any large modern bureaucratic enterprise, with departments, reporting structures, performance metrics, and in some cases, internal competition for efficiency. On the 20th of January, 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered at a lakeside villa at Am Grossen Wannsee, number 56 to 58, in the Berlin suburbs, for a conference called to coordinate the final solution of the Jewish question. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. The surviving protocol, 15 pages of minutes compiled by Adolf Eichmann after the meeting, and discovered by American war crimes investigator Robert Kempner in 1947, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the modern archive. It discusses the logistics of murdering 11 million people with the administrative register of a production planning session. Reading it, the first thing you notice is what word doesn't appear: the word murder. The second thing you notice is what does appear: population figures, territorial jurisdictions, transportation logistics, and the question of how to handle mixed cases, people with partial Jewish ancestry, using the language of a legal committee drafting regulations for a new labor classification. 8 of the 15 participants held doctoral degrees. These were not uneducated fanatics. These were Germany's most credentialed professional class, applying their expertise to the organization of continental-scale killing. There is a genuine and unresolved debate among historians about whether Wannsee represents the decision point for the final solution, or a coordination meeting for a process already underway. The intentionalist school of Holocaust historiography argues that Hitler had determined on genocide from early in the Nazi period, and that Wannsee was the bureaucratic formalization of a pre-existing directive. The functionalist school argues that the genocide evolved through bureaucratic radicalization, that the decision emerged from a process of improvisation and institutional competition, rather than from a central top-down order. The Wannsee Protocol itself is read differently by each school. Intentionalists see it as confirmation of a prior Hitler order. Functionalists note that mid-level officials are still debating methods. She's suggesting the system wasn't yet fully unified. I find the evidence points towards something between these positions. A regime with genocidal ideological intent that reached operational clarity through a process of bureaucratic evolution rather than a single moment of decision. That middle position matters because it distributes responsibility more widely than any single order model can accommodate. Before the death camps began their systematic operation, mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen had been operating behind the advancing Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front since the summer of 1941. These units, deployed as part of the invasion of the Soviet Union, killed approximately 1.5 million Jews through mass shooting operations across occupied Soviet territory in the second half of 1941 alone. Their activities were not concealed from Berlin. They compiled regular operational situation reports, Erlebnismeldungen, event reports, that were distributed to senior officials in the SS and the Reich Security Main Office. These reports recorded killing totals with numerical precision in the same bureaucratic format used for routine operational updates. They exist. They are in the archives. They were compiled, distributed, filed, and received by officials who signed off on them and moved to the next item of correspondence. The Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, transported approximately 3 million Jews to death camps over the course of the war, according to the research of historian Raoul Hilberg, whose work on the role of the railway in the Holocaust remains definitive. Almost every person murdered in a fixed extermination camp arrived by train. The trains were booked using standard commercial procedures, billed at group rates, and operated by railway staff who understood, at varying levels of explicitness, what their cargo was and where it was going. The SS was billed for these transports. The bills were paid. The paperwork was filed. The Reichsbahn's involvement wasn't a secret within the organization. It was an operational fact, managed through the same administrative channels as any other large-scale passenger transport. Eichmann's RSH A Section 4B4, the office responsible for coordinating Jewish affairs and deportation, generated an extraordinary volume of administrative correspondence about transport scheduling, population statistics, and jurisdictional coordination with occupied territories. What the captured files reveal, cross-referenced against Eichmann's testimony at his 1961 trial in Jerusalem, is a man who was not a passive bureaucrat, following orders without understanding their consequences. He understood. His operational initiative, accelerating deportation schedules, coordinating with foreign governments, resolving jurisdictional conflicts that were slowing the process, is documented in the files. His trial defense of administrative compliance is contradicted by his own paperwork showing administrative entrepreneurship. The files say what he did. His testimony says something different. The files are the more reliable source. One of the most jarring documents in this entire archive is the Reichsbank's internal account ledger for an account held under the name Max Heiliger, a false identity created to receive and process assets extracted from Holocaust victims, including gold removed from victims of the death camps. The Reichsbank opened this account in 1942, following an arrangement with senior SS officials. The bank processed these deposits. The account's existence was not known to most bank staff, but the senior officials who established and managed it knew precisely what it represented. The Reichsbank, one of the most prestigious financial institutions in Germany, staffed by career professionals with backgrounds in finance and economics, was processing the material proceeds of industrial murder through a false name account, entering the transactions in its ledgers and filing the documentation in the standard way. The bank knew. The records say so. What the Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, bureaucratic euphemism reveals is that this concealment was deliberate and systematic. RSHA, internal guidelines, established specific administrative designations for various outcomes in the killing process, creating a formal taxonomy of murder that allowed peripheral officials to process paperwork without being explicitly confronted with what they were administering. This was not accidental linguistic slippage. It was a deliberately constructed administrative language, designed to permit institutional participation at scale while managing the psychological and legal exposure of individual participants. The machinery of genocide was, in this sense, also an organizational management challenge, and the people who designed the administrative framework approached it with professional competence. Looking at this chapter in the full record, there is something important that needs to be said carefully. The scale of the bureaucratic apparatus required for the Holocaust means that responsibility was distributed across hundreds of thousands of individual professional decisions, most of which were never adjudicated at Nuremberg or in any subsequent proceeding. The Nuremberg trials addressed 24 major war criminals. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, the Doctors' trial, the Einsatzgruppen trial, the Ministry's trial, reached further. But German justice authorities estimated, in post-war investigations, that approximately 50,000 individuals were implicated by documentary evidence in war crimes who faced no judicial proceedings. The desk killers, the railway administrators, the census officials, the bank clerks, the lawyers, processed their paperwork, filed their copies, and continued their professional lives after 1945. Many of them had successful post-war careers. The Reichsbahn employees who booked the deportation trains worked for the Deutsche Bundesbahn after the war. This is not a comfortable fact. It belongs in the record. Chapter 8. Steel, Oil, and Albert Speer's Numbers. In early 1943, Albert Speer presented Hitler with a production index chart showing that German armaments output had roughly tripled since 1941. The chart existed, Hitler was shown it, and it was, in important respects, not what it appeared to be. I want to spend this chapter with that chart in one hand and the United States Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war audit of German industry in the other, because the gap between them tells a story about institutional self-deception that is, in some ways, as important as any battlefield decision in the war. Speer was appointed Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production in February of 1942, following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in a plane crash. He was 36 years old, with a background in architecture and a gift, genuinely remarkable in its way, for organizational management and, crucially, for the performance of managerial competence before a demanding audience. His primary audience was Hitler. The production increases he achieved between 1942 and 1944 were real. German armaments output did rise substantially during his tenure, but the dramatic figures he presented to Hitler, and that his own memoirs later presented to history, were constructed on a methodology that inflated the underlying reality in ways the post-war US SBS audit identified specifically. In at least one documented case involving tank production figures for late 1943, Speer's index counted repaired tanks as new production, inflating the reported figure by somewhere between 18 and 22%. This is not contested among economic historians who have worked with the primary records. It rarely appears in popular accounts. The more fundamental point, however, is this: the famous Speer miracle of tripled armaments output is almost entirely explained by a single change: the elimination of catastrophic duplication between the Army, Navy, and Luftwaffe procurement systems. Before Speer, each service branch maintained its own procurement bureaucracy, its own supplier relationships, its own production priorities, and its own allocation of scarce raw materials. These systems frequently worked at cross purposes, competed for the same industrial capacity, and generated extraordinary waste through duplication and miscoordination. Speer rationalized this. He imposed a unified production committee structure that forced the services to coordinate. The result was a substantial improvement in output from existing industrial capacity. There was no technical miracle. There was no production genius. There was the removal of deliberate institutional chaos, and the subsequent increase in efficiency appeared, by contrast with what had preceded it, as something extraordinary. Germany, in 1941, was producing armaments so inefficiently that merely organizing the system produced what looked like a revolution. Here is the comparison that Speer's production indices were careful not to present in any context that might disturb Hitler's confidence. German crude steel production in 1943, the peak year under Speer, including all areas under German control, reached approximately 34.5 million tons. That is a substantial figure. American steel production that same year was approximately 80.6 million tons. Soviet steel production, after the catastrophic losses of 1941 and the relocation of major industrial facilities east of the Urals, had recovered to somewhere around 17 to 18 million tons. The combined Allied steel output was roughly 4.5 times Germany's. No production rationalization could close a ratio of that magnitude. The war, by 1943, was being fought between economies of fundamentally different scales, and all of Speer's organizational talent was managing a deficit, not eliminating one. Germany's failure to mobilize its economy for total war until years after its major adversaries had done so is one of the period's most significant and underappreciated strategic failures. Britain had shifted to near-total war production by 1940. The Soviet Union, after the initial devastation of Barbarossa, had achieved extraordinary levels of military production by rebasing its industrial capacity in the Urals and Western Siberia, production that German planners had simply not accounted for in their operational assessments. Germany, meanwhile, continued producing civilian consumer goods, fine manufactured products, luxury items, a range of non-essential manufactured output, well into 1942. German women were not mobilized into the industrial workforce at meaningful scale until 1943 and 1944, partly for ideological reasons. Nazi doctrine held that a woman's proper role was in the home, as mother and keeper of the family. Mobilizing women into factories meant contradicting official ideology in a way the regime resisted long past the point where military necessity made it unavoidable. The forced labor system represents the darkest dimension of Germany's wartime economic management. By 1944, approximately 7.5 million foreign forced laborers, drawn from occupied territories across Europe, working under conditions that ranged from harsh to murderous, constituted nearly 30% of the German industrial workforce. This was not a peripheral feature of the war economy. It was structural. Speer's ministry managed this labor pool. His own documentation, captured after the war, records the allocation of concentration camp prisoner labor to specific industrial projects as a routine administrative matter. His post-war claims to have been ignorant of the conditions in which this labor was exploited are contradicted by his own wartime files, a pattern of documentary contradiction that appears throughout his memoir, and that Gita Sarini, in her sympathetic 1995 biography, acknowledged without fully reckoning with. I find Sereni's generosity towards Speer difficult to square with the documentary record. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against German oil production is where the economic war became most decisively material. Germany's 54 major synthetic fuel plants, which converted coal into aviation and motor fuel through the Fischer-Tropsch and Burgess hydrogenation processes at a thermodynamic efficiency of roughly 30 to 40%, were identified by Allied planners as Germany's most critical economic vulnerability. The bombing of these facilities, which intensified through 1944, produced results that appear clearly in the US SBS data. German aviation fuel production, which had been running at levels sufficient to support Luftwaffe operations through the first years of the war, collapsed dramatically as the bombing campaign intensified. By the autumn of 1944, fuel production from synthetic plants had fallen to a fraction of its earlier levels. The Luftwaffe had aircraft it could not fuel. Pilots were being trained without adequate flying hours because there wasn't enough fuel for training sorties. By the last year of the war, the most advanced air force Germany could field was grounded not by enemy air power, but by a shortage of refined petroleum products. The broader arithmetic of Allied versus German economic capacity is the ultimate context for everything Speer accomplished or claimed to accomplish. German steel, German oil, German armaments output, all of these numbers need to be read alongside the American figures, the Soviet figures, the British figures. Speer's ministry produced genuinely impressive results from a constrained industrial base, managed under increasingly difficult conditions, against an Allied bombing campaign of growing effectiveness. But the constraints were real, and the ratios were fixed. A country of 80 million people, with limited natural resources and an already strained economy, was fighting simultaneously against the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. No minister of armaments could change that fundamental arithmetic. What Speer actually accomplished, rationalization, coordination, the extraction of more output from a given industrial base, was genuine enough. What he claimed to have accomplished, and what the production indices presented to Hitler implied, was something different. The suggestion that German industrial will could compensate for Allied industrial scale. It couldn't. The numbers were always going to say so, if anyone had been willing to look at them clearly. Speer was sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg. He served his full term at Spandau prison, was released in 1966, wrote his memoirs, gave interviews, and died in 1981. The most successfully self-rehabilitated figure in the entire Nazi leadership. His memoir, Inside the Third Reich, presented him as the humane technocrat in the machine, the man who had tried to shorten the war and had opposed the regime's final excesses. The documentary record is substantially less flattering. His September 1944 memorandum to Hitler, in which he outlined strategies for maintaining armaments production specifically to extend the war effort directly contradicts his claim of having worked to end it. He had one primary client throughout his career. His name is in every document. The documents are in the archive. Chapter 9, Stalingrad, the 141-day catastrophe. There is a directive in the Russian Defense Ministry's Central Archive, a Stavka operational document from October of 1942, that tells you everything you need to understand about why Stalingrad ended the way it did. It instructs Soviet forces inside the city to hold building by building, not as a statement of desperate last resort defense, not as the emotional rallying cry it sounds like when extracted from context, but as a deliberate operational instruction. The goal, stated in the same document, is to tie down German forces in close quarters urban fighting that would make German air support impossible without risking German troops. The city was not the objective. The city was the mechanism. While the German Sixth Army consumed itself fighting for factories and apartment blocks and grain elevators, Soviet Stavka planners were somewhere else entirely, drawing operational arrows on maps that curved around the city like a hand closing into a fist. Two entirely different battles were happening in the same place, and only one side understood what the other was doing. Vasily Chuikov took command of the 62nd Army, defending Stalingrad on the 13th of September, 1942. He inherited approximately 54,000 men, a city largely in ruins from months of aerial bombardment, and a front line that in places ran along the bank of the Volga, meaning retreat was, literally, into the river. His tactical innovation, documented in his own army's operations log, was the deliberate compression of the front, bringing Soviet defensive positions so close to German lines that Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft couldn't support German infantry without risking their own troops. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war. Every building became a contested structure. Every floor of every building was potentially a separate tactical objective. The grain elevator south of the city centre changed hands repeatedly over approximately 2 months of fighting, its control documented in both German and Soviet unit diaries, which describe the same physical structure completely differently, as though the two sides were fighting in different buildings that happened to occupy the same coordinates. The German Sixth Army's commander, Friedrich Paulus, had reached Stalingrad in late August, after a campaign that had already stretched his supply lines and consumed his reserves at a rate that the Wehrmacht's logistics system was not designed to sustain. By September, his forces were engaged in urban fighting that negated almost every operational advantage that had made German arms successful, from Poland to Ukraine. The mobility, the combined arms coordination, the ability to concentrate force at the point of decision. In Stalingrad, the point of decision was a room on the 3rd floor of a building, on a street that no longer appeared on any usable map. German infantry and Soviet defenders were sometimes separated by a wall. Artillery was almost useless at these ranges. The Luftwaffe couldn't support without hitting its own men. The panzers couldn't maneuver in streets choked with rubble. Every advantage the Wehrmacht had accumulated since 1939 was being systematically neutralized by the specific geography of a ruined Soviet industrial city on the west bank of the Volga. While this was happening, the Stavka was assembling what would become Operation Uranus. Planning had begun in September of 1942, simultaneous with the heaviest fighting in the city, and was developed by Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky in meetings with Stalin that were, by Soviet standards, extraordinarily secret. More than 1 million Soviet troops were moved into position on the flanks of the German Sixth Army. A build-up of that magnitude, executed in the autumn of 1942, without German army intelligence detecting it in time to respond. The German forces holding the flanks of the Stalingrad salient were primarily Romanian and Italian formations. Allied armies, with inadequate anti-tank weaponry, stretched across long frontages with insufficient reserves behind them. German intelligence had identified these weaknesses. The OKH's own assessments noted the vulnerability of the flanks. The warnings existed in the records. They did not produce adequate response. On the 19th of November, 1942, the northern pincer of Operation Uranus struck the Romanian Third Army. The following day, the southern pincer struck the Romanian Fourth Army. By the 23rd of November, the two pincers had linked up at the town of Calac, closing the encirclement around approximately 290,000 Axis personnel, the German Sixth Army, and attached forces. Paulus immediately requested permission to break out to the west, where German relief forces might reach him. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad as a fortress and be supplied by air. This decision, and specifically the question of whether a breakout in late November might have succeeded before the encirclement ring hardened, is one of the most debated command questions of the entire war. Paulus's own post-war account and the OKH war diary records give different timelines for when the breakout request was made and what the prospects were. The primary sources don't fully agree, and the historiographical argument has continued for 80 years without complete resolution. What is not in dispute is the arithmetic of the Luftwaffe's air supply operation. The Sixth Army required a minimum of somewhere between 500 and 700 tons of supplies per day to function at minimal operational capacity: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. The figure Goering promised Hitler the Luftwaffe could deliver was 300 tons per day, itself below the minimum requirement. What the Luftwaffe actually averaged over the entire duration of the airlift from late November 1942 to early February 1943 was approximately 116 tons per day. The Junkers 52 transport aircraft, the workhorse of the airlift, could carry roughly 1.5 to 2 tons of cargo per sortie. Reaching even the promised 300 tons daily would have required somewhere around 150 to 200 sorties per day into an encircled pocket under heavy Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The average actually achieved was a fraction of that. The arithmetic made survival impossible before a single Soviet tank moved closer to the perimeter. The Prokhorovka engagement of the 12th of July, 1943, fought during the subsequent Kursk campaign, has been described for decades as the largest tank battle in history, involving figures of 800 or more Soviet tanks against 600 or more German, locked in a vast armoured collision on the steppe. Post-Soviet Russian archival work has substantially revised these numbers. German records suggest the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which bore the main German effort on that day, had approximately 294 serviceable tanks. The Soviet figure has also been substantially revised downward from the numbers that appeared in Soviet-era accounts. The battle was real, it was costly for both sides, and it was decisive in ending Operation Citadel, the German summer offensive of which it was part. But the largest tank battle in history designation, based on figures that appear to have been inflated in Soviet accounts and overestimated in some German ones, is now considered significantly overstated by the historians who have worked with the corrected archival material. This matters because myths, when they're large enough, distort how we understand what actually happened and why. By the 2nd of February 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus promoted by Hitler to that rank the previous night, in a signal widely understood to mean that German field marshals did not surrender, signed the capitulation of the German Sixth Army's surviving elements. Approximately 91,000 prisoners were taken in total. Of these, roughly 6,000 would return to Germany after the war. The others died in Soviet captivity from disease, starvation, exposure, and the general conditions of prisoner camps that were not designed to absorb the sudden influx of nearly 100,000 men in the Russian winter. The number who died in captivity is itself contested between German and Soviet sources, but the scale of attrition is not. The Sixth Army went into Stalingrad as one of the Wehrmacht's most capable formations. It ceased to exist as a fighting force in the rubble of a Soviet industrial city that had been selected as a target partly because it bore the name of Stalin. Hitler's insistence on capturing it and Stalin's insistence on holding it shaped the battle's course in ways that had as much to do with symbolic politics as operational logic. What Stalingrad permanently altered was not just the strategic balance on the Eastern Front, though it did that, but something harder to quantify: the psychological reality inside the Wehrmacht and inside Germany. The news of the Sixth Army's destruction, even filtered through Goebbels's propaganda apparatus, produced a national period of mourning that was, by the standards of the regime's public communication, extraordinary. 3 days of music and silence on German radio, the first formal acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened. The mood reports from the Wehrmacht's postal censors, the Stimmungsberichte, show a measurable shift in the language soldiers were using in their letters home from the early spring of 1943. The confident assertions of the 1941 summer are largely gone. What replaces them is harder to characterize: a kind of determined endurance, stripped of the earlier expectation that the war would be won quickly. Germany would fight for more than 2 additional years after Stalingrad, but the psychological frame within which that fighting occurred had changed. The men who had gone east to conquer were now fighting not to win, but increasingly not to lose. Shun Chapter 10, the SS State within the state. There is an internal Wehrmacht memorandum from the summer of 1942, held in the Bundesarchiv, that is, in its dry, bureaucratic fury, one of the more revealing documents of the entire war. It is a protest from a Wehrmacht operations section about railway capacity. Specifically, it protests that SS deportation trains are consuming railway capacity urgently required for ammunition resupply to Army Group South during a critical summer offensive. 2 organizations operating within the same state, both nominally serving the same war effort, are fighting over the same trains for purposes that have nothing to do with each other. One organization wants to move shells to the front. The other wants to move people to camps in Poland. The memo expresses frustration at the SS's claim on a scarce resource. The SS, according to the subsequent record, retained its train allocations. This is not a peripheral detail. It reveals something essential about how the Third Reich actually functioned. The SS is almost always presented in documentary treatments as a monolith, the black uniformed enforcement arm of the Nazi state, unified in purpose and command. The reality, as the institutional records reveal, was considerably messier. By 1944, the SS had become something more like a parallel state operating inside Germany. A military force, an economic enterprise, a police organization, an intelligence service, and a colonizing institution, all under the nominal authority of Heinrich Himmler, who himself held so many separate titles and commanded so many separate bureaucratic fiefdoms that the organizational chart requires genuine effort to follow. Himmler simultaneously held the positions of Reich SS leader, chief of the German police, Reich commissioner for the strengthening of Germandom, and, from 1943, Reich minister of the interior. Each of these positions carried its own budget, its own staff, its own institutional culture, and its own competing interests. This wasn't bureaucratic accident. It was a power architecture deliberately designed to make Himmler simultaneously indispensable to the regime and impossible to remove from any single point of failure. The Waffen SS, the armed military wing, expanded from 3 divisions in 1940 to 38 divisions by 1945. That expansion is frequently cited as evidence of the SS's military importance. It is also evidence of a systematic institutional cannibalization of Wehrmacht manpower. The army's own personnel records document consistent protests that SS preferential recruitment was drawing the highest quality conscripts from the Wehrmacht's available pool, offering better pay, better equipment, and a more prestigious institutional identity, and that this was degrading the quality of regular army formations at precisely the moment when the Eastern Front demanded the highest possible quality of infantry. The rivalry wasn't rhetorical. It was measured in the manpower that arrived at training depots stamped with SS allocation instead of Wehrmacht allocation, and in the equipment priority that favored SS formations in ways that OKH found impossible to fully override. The SS officer casualty rate tells a specific story about institutional culture that deserves attention. Waffen SS formations had a higher officer casualty rate than comparable Wehrmacht units throughout most of the war. This wasn't primarily because they were deployed in more dangerous sectors, though in some periods they were. It was because SS tactical culture explicitly encouraged officers to lead from the front, in close physical proximity to the fighting. This culture was partly genuine. There was a real ethos of personal courage in the Waffen-SS's better formations, but it was also partly institutional theatre, the cultivation of a heroic public image that could justify continued SS expansion at the expense of Wehrmacht resources. Officers were, in a measurable and documented sense, being spent partly to build a brand. The brand was being used to argue for more resources. The additional resources were being used to expand the institution. The institutional expansion justified further brand investment. The logic was self-reinforcing and, for Wehrmacht planners trying to manage a losing war, deeply inconvenient. The SSWVHA, the main economic and administrative office, represents a dimension of the SS that almost entirely disappears from popular accounts. The SS as a major industrial enterprise. By the middle years of the war, SS-owned businesses operated using concentration camp prisoner labor in quarrying, construction, armaments manufacturing, textiles, food processing, and other sectors. The value of this portfolio, documented in WVHA files captured by Allied forces and now held at NRA, ran to hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. Himmler was not simply a police chief. He was a major industrial operator, commanding a workforce of prisoners whose labor cost him nothing in wages and whose mortality he was not required to account for in any standard industrial ledger. The SS's economic interests created institutional incentives to maintain and expand the camp system that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with the economic interests of a self-sustaining bureaucratic empire. The relationship between the SS and the Abwehr, the Wehrmacht's military intelligence service, commanded by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, was one of the Third Reich's most complex institutional rivalries. Canaris was a man of considerable operational skill, and, it became apparent after the war, considerable moral complexity. He appears, from the archival record, to have used his position to obstruct some of the regime's activities while publicly serving it, a balancing act that required extraordinary personal compartmentalization. Himmler had long sought to absorb the Abwehr's functions into the SS intelligence apparatus. Following Canaris's arrest in 1944, on suspicion of involvement in anti-regime activities, the Abwehr was effectively dissolved and its functions transferred to the RSHA. Canaris was executed in April of 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender. The full record of his activities remains partially destroyed or classified. Himmler's independent peace negotiations with the Swedish representative Count Folke Bernadotte in the spring of 1945 represent the moment when the SS state's internal logic finally collided with reality. Himmler apparently believed he could negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, that his position as the commander of Germany's internal security apparatus gave him the standing to make such an approach, and that the Western Allies might prefer him to the prospect of a Soviet-dominated German collapse. The Allied response, as recorded in the intelligence files of the period, was swift dismissal. The approach was treated as evidence of a man who had spent years operating inside a sealed system of self-reinforcing power and had entirely lost the ability to assess how he appeared from outside it. Hitler, learning of the negotiations, declared Himmler a traitor, the last of many such declarations in the bunker's final weeks, as the Reich's leadership turned on itself with the same energy it had once directed outward. What the SS's institutional history ultimately demonstrates is the way in which a totalitarian state generates its own internal contradictions. The organization created to enforce ideological purity and state security developed economic interests of its own. The military formation, created to project political power, competed for resources with the army it was supposed to complement. The intelligence apparatus, created to protect the regime, harbored in its senior leadership men with at least ambivalent attitudes toward its survival. The competing institutions spent enormous energy managing their rivalries with each other, energy that was not, therefore, being directed at the regime's actual adversaries. And the railway cars that carried deportees to the camps in Poland were, at least on certain days in certain sectors, the same railway cars that a Wehrmacht operations officer needed for ammunition. The Third Reich was not a smoothly functioning machine of oppression. It was a collection of competing bureaucracies, united by ideology and divided by interest, held together by the personal authority of one man. And when that authority began to fragment, the entire structure unraveled with a speed that surprised even those inside it. Chapter 11. The Desert and the Strategic Vacuum. This is the shorter chapter, and I want to be straightforward about why. The North Africa campaign, for all its dramatic qualities and all the romantic mythology that accumulated around it during and after the war, was not a decisive theatre. It was an expensive sideshow. Germany sent its most celebrated operational commander, some of its best equipped formations, and an enormous quantity of irreplaceable fuel, ammunition, and shipping to a theatre that could not be adequately supplied, could not materially threaten British strategic interests even in its most successful moments, and ultimately cost the Axis approximately 300,000 troops who might have been more consequential elsewhere. The brevity of this chapter is itself a historiographical argument. Some theatres deserve less attention than they receive, and the literary romance of tank warfare in the desert has, for decades, purchased more documentary time than the strategic facts justify. Germany's involvement in North Africa began not as a strategic choice, but as an obligation. The Italian military's catastrophic performance against the British in Libya in the winter of 1940 to 1941, a campaign that saw the British Western Desert Force destroy an Italian army several times its own size and advance hundreds of miles into Libya, confronted Hitler with the prospect of a friendly government collapsing under Allied pressure on Germany's southern flank. The Afrika Korps was dispatched to Libya as what the OKW orders explicitly described as a defensive blocking force, a formation intended to stabilize the front, not advance it. Erwin Rommel, commanding the force, began offensive operations within days of arriving and never really stopped. His subsequent advances into Egypt were, technically speaking, insubordinate. He attacked without authorization, repeatedly, and was retroactively accommodated because he kept winning. The romantic myth of the Desert Fox begins with an officer who was, by the strict reading of his orders, conducting unauthorized operations from the first week of his command. A supply manifest from June of 1942, cataloguing cargo delivered to the Afrika Korps by air from Sicily, records 12 tons of tank spare parts, 3 tons of rations, 4 tons of fuel, and a crate of wine for an Italian command mess. Rommel's diary entry for approximately the same day records his frustration at fuel shortages that were hampering his operational planning. That juxtaposition is not just ironic, it is structurally informative. The supply system serving the Afrika Korps was simultaneously insufficient for its military requirements and sufficiently functional for its logistical luxuries, which tells you something about whose priorities were actually being served by the Mediterranean supply chain. The Afrika Korps required a minimum of approximately 70,000 tons of supplies per month to conduct sustained offensive operations. At peak, Axis shipping to North Africa delivered somewhere around 45 to 50,000 tons monthly, and that figure fell significantly once British ultra-intelligence, derived from broken Enigma intercepts, allowed the Royal Navy and RAF to interdict Axis convoys with increasing precision. By late 1942, approximately 40% of all Axis shipping to North Africa was being sunk. Rommel was fighting a campaign whose logistics had been compromised at the source. The Italian armed forces in North Africa deserve a specific paragraph they almost never receive in English-language documentary treatments. The standard narrative, German and Allied alike, dismisses the Italian military contribution with varying degrees of contempt. The archival record is more complicated. The Folgore Parachute Division at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November of 1942 fought to near annihilation in defensive positions, without adequate supply and against overwhelming Allied material superiority, in a manner that several German after-action reports noted with specific respect. These men were poorly equipped, undersupplied, and fighting in a theatre they had limited strategic interest in, and even more limited ability to influence. Their performance in those specific circumstances was noted in German records at the time. It has been largely written out of the narrative since. The British ultra-intelligence advantage at El Alamein represents one of the war's clearest examples of signals intelligence determining operational outcomes. Montgomery's planning for the Second Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942 was informed by a detailed picture of Rommel's dispositions, supply state, and operational intentions that Rommel simply could not match. Rommel had returned to Germany for medical treatment when the Allied offensive opened. His letters home during this period, published posthumously in the Rommel papers, contain remarkably honest assessments of the supply situation and the campaign's likely trajectory. His official after-action reports maintain a different, more optimistic register. The discrepancy between his private letters and his official communications during this period suggests a man managing two separate audiences, his family and his superiors. with two different versions of the same reality. The surrender in Tunisia in May of 1943 is almost always treated as a footnote in documentary treatments of the war, subordinate to the drama of Stalingrad that had occurred 3 months earlier. It shouldn't be. Approximately 275,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia in the space of a few days, a collapse of comparable scale to Stalingrad in terms of forces lost, though with a far lower human toll in terms of subsequent prisoner mortality. Two entire army groups essentially ceased to exist. The Afrika Korps, the formation that had carried Rommel's operational brilliance through 3 years of desert campaigning, surrendered with the rest. The German and Italian forces that might have been available for the defense of Sicily and southern Italy, if they had been withdrawn in time, or if the North Africa commitment had been wound down earlier, were instead lost entirely. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July of 1943, which Hitler cited as his reason for cancelling the Kursk offensive, was made materially easier by the fact that the defending forces had already been consumed in Tunisia. The strategic legacy of the North Africa campaign is, from Germany's perspective, almost entirely negative. It committed resources the Reich couldn't spare to a theatre it couldn't adequately supply, in pursuit of objectives that, even if achieved, would not have materially altered the fundamental strategic balance. The Mediterranean was important to Britain as an imperial lifeline. It was not important to Germany's actual strategic requirements, which were concentrated in the east. The commitment to North Africa was, at its root, an alliance obligation to a partner whose military failures had created a liability that Germany could neither ignore nor adequately resolve. The lesson about how alliance commitments can draw major powers into strategically irrational theatres is written clearly in the supply manifests and casualty records of 3 years of desert campaigning. Chapter 12, Kursk. When the numbers ran out on the 5th of July, 1943, the first day of Operation Citadel, Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, a maintenance report from a German Panzer Corps noted something that should have been headline news. Of 192 Panther tanks committed to the offensive's southern thrust, approximately 45 had broken down before reaching the front line, not destroyed by Soviet anti-tank fire, not lost to mines, not abandoned due to combat damage, broken down mechanically on the march to the battle. The primary failure mode was noted in the report with technical precision: Maybach HL-230 engine overheating, caused by fuel system seal failures under sustained operation. Germany's newest, most technically sophisticated tank, the weapon system that Hitler had specifically demanded be ready for Citadel, and whose delayed availability had caused the offensive to be postponed from May to July, was breaking down at the rate of nearly 1 in 4 before the battle began. By the evening of the 10th of July, according to subsequent German records, there were only 10 operational Panthers at the front. 10 of the original 192. Kursk is typically described as the largest tank battle in history, a description that requires some careful unpacking, as we've seen already with Prokhorovka's revised numbers. What is not in dispute is its strategic significance. Operation Citadel was Germany's attempt to destroy the large Soviet salient around the city of Kursk through a double envelopment using concentrated armored force from north and south simultaneously. The plan was conceptually sound. The execution ran into a problem that the planning process had chosen to minimize. The Soviets knew it was coming, not approximately, specifically. Soviet intelligence fed through multiple channels, including the Lucy spy network operating through Switzerland and the Soviets' own extensive radio intercept capability, had a detailed picture of German intentions weeks before the offensive launched. Stavka used this knowledge to construct what was, by the time German armor rolled forward on the 5th of July, the most elaborate defensive system in the history of warfare. 8 successive defensive lines, constructed to a depth of approximately 300 kilometers, waited behind the front. More than 300,000 Soviet civilians had been conscripted to dig trenches, lay minefields, and construct anti-tank obstacles across the salient. The minefields alone, Soviet engineers laid approximately 1.5 million mines in the Kursk salient, represented a density of obstacles that German sappers clearing lanes for advancing armor had never encountered in anything like this concentration. When the panzer divisions rolled forward on the 5th of July, they weren't advancing across open steppe. They were advancing into a prepared killing ground that had been weeks in construction, specifically designed to absorb, slow, and destroy an armored offensive of precisely the type Citadel represented. The Germans weren't surprising anyone. They were walking into a position the Soviets had been reinforcing since April. The Panther tank's mechanical catastrophe at Kursk is worth understanding in specific technical terms, because it reveals something important about the German armaments program more broadly. The Panther's transmission, the AK-7200 gearbox, had been designed for a vehicle of approximately 35 tons. The Panther weighed 44 tons in its production configuration. The transmission was chronically overstressed from its first operational deployment, producing a failure mode in which the final drive gear teeth stripped under sustained high torque demand, particularly during the kind of cross-country movement that armored operations required. Repairing this failure required complete transmission removal, a 6 to 8 hour workshop operation requiring specialized tools and trained personnel. Frontline units had neither in sufficient quantities. Every Panther transmission failure therefore effectively removed the vehicle from service for days or weeks in a battle where the operational window was measured in days. This was not an unknown problem when Citadel launched. German tank engineers had flagged the transmission issue during testing. Hitler's insistence on using the Panthers at Kursk before their mechanical problems had been resolved overrode the technical assessment of the people responsible for knowing whether the vehicles were ready. The Tiger I tanks at Kursk, approximately 146 of them, according to figures from the Tank Museum's analysis, performed better than the Panthers in terms of reliability, and largely because the Tiger had been in service since late 1942, and its most acute mechanical problems had been identified and partially addressed. But the Tiger's logistical burden was itself a strategic liability. The Maybach HL-230 engine, shared with the Panther, consumed fuel at roughly 3 liters per kilometer on roads and up to 7 or 8 liters per kilometer cross-country. A Tiger operating across the churned earth and destroyed terrain of a major summer offensive was consuming fuel at rates that stressed the supply system from the first day. The operational radius between refueling was constrained. The weight, 57 tons, made river crossings and bridging operations an engineering challenge of a different order from lighter vehicles. Every Tiger in the battle represented an enormous investment of production capacity, trained crew, logistics support, and fuel that could theoretically have been distributed across a much larger number of lighter, simpler, more maintainable vehicles. Hitler cancelled Operation Citadel on the 13th of July, citing the Allied landings in Sicily 2 days earlier as requiring redeployment of forces. German commanders on the ground, Manstein's post-war papers are clear on this point, argued the Sicily landings were a convenient rationale for ending an offensive that was already failing to achieve its objectives on its own terms. Manstein believed he was on the verge of operational success in the South when the cancellation order came. The historical debate about who is correct remains unresolved. And what is not contested is the material consequence. The German armoured formations that had been committed to Citadel were withdrawn, transferred, or sent to other sectors in a state of significant attrition, never to be reconstituted as an offensive force on the Eastern Front. The last major German attempt to seize the initiative in the East had consumed irreplaceable equipment and experienced crews in exchange for no territorial gain and a failed encirclement. The Soviet counteroffensive that followed Kursk, Operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, launched in mid-July and early August of 1943, demonstrated what the Eastern Front looked like when Soviet forces held operational initiative and German forces lacked the reserves to mount a coherent response. German Army Group Center and Army Group South were pushed back across wide sectors. Kharkov, which had changed hands 3 times in the previous 18 months, fell to Soviet forces on the 23rd of August, 1943. An OKH operational directive issued in September of that year established a new framework for German operations on the Eastern Front called Bewegliche Abwehr, Mobile Defense. It is a doctrinal document written in the careful technical language of military operational theory. It is also, if you read it, knowing what it was responding to, a formal acknowledgement that Germany had permanently lost strategic initiative in the East. No public announcement, no ceremony. A doctrine title quietly issued that said everything about the war's direction that the regime's public communications were taking increasingly extreme measures to obscure. In 1943, the German army lost approximately 9,000 tanks and assault guns across all fronts. Soviet production that year, much of it from the factories relocated east of the Urals after Barbarossa, significantly outpaced German replacements. The attrition arithmetic of the Eastern Front, which had been unfavorable to Germany since 1942, became structurally decisive after Kursk. Germany could no longer replace what it lost at the pace the fighting was consuming it. The Panther's transmission problems, the Tiger's fuel consumption, the logistical demands of maintaining technically complex vehicles in field conditions, all of these contributed to a qualitative attrition rate that compounded the quantitative one. Germany was losing experienced tank crews, master mechanics, maintenance specialists, people who couldn't be replaced by production, increases the way a tank could theoretically be replaced by another tank. The numbers ran out at Kursk. Not all at once, the Wehrmacht would fight effectively for almost 2 more years and would continue to inflict enormous casualties on Soviet forces. But the direction was fixed. After July of 1943, the question on the Eastern Front was not whether Germany would be defeated. It was when and at what cost, and how far east the eventual boundary would run. Chapter 13. The Resistance That Almost Was. Open a Gestapo investigation file from October of 1944, and you find something unexpected. Not the melodrama of conspiracy thrillers, not the clean moral clarity of resistance mythology. What you find is a bureaucratic case management document. Suspects listed by rank and function, evidence catalogued, interrogation summaries cross-referenced. The whole apparatus of a professional criminal investigation applied to an underground political network. The file treats the July 20th conspiracy as what, from the Gestapo's operational perspective, it was a law enforcement matter. 722 individuals investigated, 198 executed. Case references, interview transcripts, physical evidence logs. The language is the same flat professional prose you'd find in any serious criminal investigation. Reading it that way, as a police file rather than as history, tells you something about how totalitarian states process challenge. They bureaucratize it. They file it. They make it legible within existing institutional categories, which strips it of any capacity to be understood as what it actually was. The German resistance to Hitler. And there was genuine resistance, more widely distributed than post-war mythology tends to acknowledge and simultaneously more compromised than the same mythology is usually willing to admit, had roots that stretched back almost to the beginning of the regime. Within the Wehrmacht's own intelligence service, the Abwehr, a group of senior officers centered around Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and his deputy, General Hans Oster, had from as early as 1938 been attempting to alert Western governments to German war plans, hoping that a credible Allied military response might trigger a domestic coup against Hitler's leadership. In the autumn of 1938, as the Czechoslovakia crisis built toward Munich, Oster passed detailed information about German military intentions to foreign contacts. The British government received this information and, on the whole, declined to act on it with any force that would have served the conspirators' purpose. The failure of the 1938 resistance doesn't belong entirely to the Germans who risked their lives attempting it. Some of it belongs to the governments that chose not to meet them halfway. To the Kreisau Circle, named after the Silesian estate of Count Helmuth James von Moltke, great-grandnephew of the famous Prussian field marshal, was a resistance formation of a genuinely different character from the military conspirators. Its members were drawn from across the ideological spectrum: conservative aristocrats, social democrats, trade unionists, Protestant and Catholic clergy, former civil servants. They met from around 1940 onward to discuss not the assassination of Hitler. Von Moltke personally opposed assassination on moral grounds, but the political and moral architecture of a post-Nazi Germany. What kind of state should follow? What institutional safeguards should it have? What relationship should it maintain with the European community around it? These are not the questions of men planning a coup. These are the questions of men planning a civilization under conditions that made the planning itself a capital offense. Von Moltke was arrested in January of 1944, not because of any specific conspiracy, but because he had warned a friend of an impending Gestapo interrogation. He was executed on the 23rd of January, 1945. His letters from prison to his wife Freya, written between his arrest and execution, and published long after the war, are among the most morally searching documents in the German language. He wrote at one point that he had stood before Freisler's court, and what mattered to him was that he had done so as a Christian and as a German, and that no one could take either of those things from him. Here is where I need to say something uncomfortable about the German resistance, because the discomfort is in the historical record and it matters. The social composition of the resistance was overwhelmingly aristocratic, military, and conservative. Men from old Prussian military families, members of Germany's pre-Nazi governing class, people who had in many cases served the regime or accommodated it for years before concluding that it had to be destroyed. Most of them came to active resistance late. Some of them, and this is documented in the conspiratorial correspondence that the Gestapo captured, harbored plans for a separate peace with the Western Allies while continuing the war against the Soviet Union. They opposed Hitler, absolutely. But what they envisioned replacing him with was, in some cases, a rather conservative German state, not a democratic one. The post-war Federal Republic was built partly on the mythology of a unified, morally clear German resistance. The actual resistance was neither unified nor morally uncomplicated. Holding both of those things simultaneously is what historical honesty requires. On the 20th of July, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a Bavarian aristocrat who had lost his right hand and 2 fingers of his left hand in Tunisia, who had reached active resistance after years of gradual disillusionment with the regime, carried a briefcase containing British-manufactured plastic explosive into a conference room at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. He had been unable to arm both of the 2 bombs available to him in the time he had before entering the conference. Using pliers with his remaining fingers, he armed one and left the other, unarmed, in his briefcase in the car outside. He placed the armed briefcase under the table near Hitler's position and then left the room on a pretext. Some time after he left, the accounts differ slightly on exactly when and by whom. The briefcase was moved, shifted, around a thick wooden table support strut that partially redirected the blast when it detonated at roughly 12:42. 4 people died. Hitler was not among them. The concrete bunker that normally housed such conferences had been moved to a wooden structure for ventilation purposes on that particular summer day. A concrete ceiling and walls would have made survival effectively impossible for anyone in the room. The wood dispersed the blast. History turned on the thickness of a table leg, and the decision, made a day or 2 before, to change rooms. In Berlin, at the Bendler Block, the War Ministry building where the conspirators had established their operational headquarters, the hours following the explosion were catastrophic in their disorganization. The conspirators were uncertain whether Hitler was dead. For approximately 3 hours after the detonation, before they began issuing the Valkyrie orders that were supposed to mobilize the reserve army to secure Berlin, they waited for confirmation that wouldn't come in any certain form. Those 3 hours were fatal. By the time the Valkyrie signals began flowing, Goebbels's ministry was already issuing counter-orders through the same communications network. SS units were receiving contradictory instructions from both the conspirators and the still-functioning regime. Radio broadcast operators were receiving competing commands about what to put on the air. By the evening of July 20th, Hitler had broadcast to the nation confirming his survival. Stauffenberg and 3 other leading conspirators were shot in the Bendler Block courtyard before dawn on the 21st of July. They were among the first to die. They would not be the last. The trials before Roland Freisler's People's Court were filmed at Hitler's explicit order. The footage exists. It is in the Bundesarchiv. It shows men standing before a screaming judge, in clothes several sizes too large because their belts and suspenders had been removed. A deliberate humiliation designed to make them look ridiculous as well as criminal. Freisler was, by all accounts, extraordinary in his theatrical contempt, performing outrage for the cameras with the energy of a man who understood exactly what the filming was for. He was killed on the 3rd of February, 1945, when American bombs struck the People's Court building in Berlin. There is, in some accounts, an irony here that feels too neat to be entirely trusted, but it appears to be simply documented. The judge who had presided over show trials of men who tried to end the war was himself killed by the air power of a country that was ending it. The bombs didn't choose their targets. Erwin Rommel's connection to the July 20th conspiracy deserves its own paragraph of honest uncertainty. His name appeared in testimony extracted from conspirators under Gestapo interrogation. His actual role, whether he was a genuine active participant, a peripheral figure whose name was raised by people under extreme duress, or an entirely innocent man whose war wound and known frustrations with Hitler's strategic direction made him a convenient name to mention, is genuinely unresolved in the historical record. What is documented is that he was given a choice: face public trial and have his family suffer the consequences of a traitor's sentence, or take cyanide in private and be buried with full military honors as a war hero who had died from complications of his battle wound. He died on the 14th of October, 1944. The regime announced he had died from his injuries. He was given a state funeral. The SS officers, who waited outside the room while he took the pill, attended the ceremony. What the German resistance accomplished, or failed to accomplish, is a question that has no clean answer. It didn't stop the war. It didn't prevent the Holocaust. It didn't save the lives of the millions who died in the war's final year after July 20th, 1944. What it did do, at the cost of the lives of those who participated in it, is establish that there were Germans who understood what was happening, chose at genuine personal risk to oppose it, and acted on that choice. That is not nothing. It is also not enough. And the distance between those two statements is, in some ways, the most important space this chapter has to offer. Chapter 14. D-Day, Germany's Unasked Question. There is an entry in the German OKW telephone operations log from the early morning of the 6th of June, 1944. It records, "She in the flat, administrative language of a duty officer making routine entries, that operations staff have been notified of large-scale Allied landings on the Normandy coast. It records that requests for the release of armoured reserves have been received from OB West, the German command in France. And it records in the same register that the Führer has not been informed because he is asleep, and standing protocol specifies that he is not to be awakened. The largest seaborne invasion in the history of warfare had been underway for several hours. The German command structure that could, in theory, have authorized the only armored response capable of driving the landings back into the sea was waiting, as protocol required, for a man to finish sleeping. That entry is in the archive. The mundane formality of it is not ironic. It is the point. The German failure to respond effectively to the Normandy landings on the 6th of June, 1944, is almost never told as primarily a story about command architecture. It gets told as a story about Rommel's absence, or about the Panzer Reserve, or about Allied deception, or about Hitler's delay. All of these elements are real. But the underlying structure that made each of them catastrophic was a command system that three separate commanders had organized around three incompatible strategic concepts, without any mechanism for resolving the incompatibility before the invasion made resolution urgent. Rommel, commanding Army Group B, believed that Allied air superiority made it impossible to move armoured reserves to the front once an invasion had begun. Therefore, panzers had to be deployed close to the beaches in advance, ready to destroy the landings in their most vulnerable first hours. Von Rundstedt, commanding OB West, believed that the invasion's actual direction couldn't be confirmed until it had developed sufficiently to distinguish the real landing from a potential deception. Therefore, a strong central armoured reserve should be held back to strike decisively once the picture clarified. Hitler believed that the Panzer Reserve was too important a strategic asset to delegate to either of his theatre commanders, and retained personal control of several key divisions. The compromise that resulted, some armoured forces forward under Rommel, and some in central reserve under Geyer von Schweppenburg, the most powerful formations under Hitler's direct authority, combined the weaknesses of all three approaches while capturing the strengths of none. Rommel was not at his headquarters when the landings began. He was in Germany, at his home in Herrlingen in Swabia, having taken leave to celebrate his wife's birthday. A decision that was planned weeks in advance, was processed through standard leave channels, and was considered operationally acceptable because German intelligence had assessed the probability of an imminent Allied landing as relatively low. This assessment was partly the result of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan that had spent months constructing a fictional army group under the nominal command of General George Patton, apparently poised to land in the Pas de Calais. German intelligence believed, and continued to believe well into the afternoon of June 6th, that the Normandy landings might be a diversionary feint preceding the real assault further east. 19 powerful German divisions, including important armoured reserves, spent the critical hours of the 6th of June waiting in the Pas de Calais area for an attack that never came. Operation Fortitude didn't just deceive the Germans about where the invasion would fall. It kept a large portion of their strategic reserve frozen in place after the actual landing had begun, and the diversionary possibility was becoming harder to sustain. The requests to release the Panzer Reserve, specifically the 12th SS Panzer Division and others positioned in the OKW Reserve, began reaching Hitler's headquarters in the early morning hours of the 6th of June. They were denied. Hitler had taken a sleeping compound the night before, and the standing orders were clear. He was not to be disturbed. The requests were renewed. They were denied again. According to the OKW operations logs, Hitler finally gave permission to begin releasing elements of the reserve at roughly 2 in the afternoon, approximately 9 hours after the first troops had landed on the beaches. By that time, Allied air interdiction of road and rail routes in Normandy was operating at full intensity. Moving armoured columns in daylight under Allied air cover that had been specifically tasked with preventing exactly this movement meant accepting catastrophic losses before any formation could reach the battle. The 12th SS Panzer Division spent most of the 6th of June in transit, reaching the battle area in darkness and in a state of reduced effectiveness from a day of contested movement. The 21st Panzer Division was the only major German armoured formation immediately available for counterattack on June 6th. Positioned near Caen, it was the closest panzer unit to the landing beaches. Its counterattack in the late afternoon of June 6th is one of the campaign's most operationally consequential and least discussed moments. Elements of the division actually fought their way through the gap between the British Sword Beach landing and the Canadian Juno Beach landing and reached the coast, the only German armoured force to do so on D-Day. They were at the sea. They were between 2 Allied beachheads, and then they received reports of Allied airborne forces landing behind them, a glider landing that appeared to threaten their route of retreat, and they turned back. The gap between the Allied beaches remained unexploited. By the following morning, it had closed. The after-action reporting from the 21st Panzer Division on this episode is fragmentary, and the tactical decision that produced the withdrawal has been argued over by historians ever since. What is clear is that the one moment on June 6th, when German armour had both the position and the opportunity to create serious problems for the Allied consolidation, was not taken advantage of. Rundstedt's post-war account of June 6th, given to the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart, claims that he identified the Normandy landings as the real invasion by 9 in the morning. The OKW operational logs suggest the picture at German High Command remained considerably less certain well into the afternoon. These two accounts cannot both be fully accurate. Rundstedt's post-war testimony, like the post-war testimony of most senior German commanders, was given in a context where the reconstruction of one's decision-making as clear-sighted and rationally sound served obvious personal purposes. The OKW logs are a contemporaneous document without that particular bias. Between a man's memory of how clearly he understood a situation and the actual operational record of the decisions made at the time, I find the contemporaneous record more reliable on questions of certainty. The Atlantic Wall, the coastal fortification system that stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, was presented in German public communications as an impenetrable barrier. The construction records of Organisation Todt document an enormous engineering effort. Approximately 17 million cubic meters of concrete poured along its length. Rommel's own inspection diary from the early months of 1944 is, by contrast, scathing about the wall's actual state of readiness in the Normandy sector specifically. He found sectors inadequately mined, positions incomplete, beach obstacles insufficient, and garrison forces of questionable quality. The gap between the public image of the Atlantic Wall and its operational reality was, in the Normandy sector, substantial. This discrepancy between what the German public was being told and what the army's own inspectors were finding is itself a document of the regime's condition by the spring of 1944. A system that had been generating optimistic public statements long after the operational reality had ceased to support them. The Omaha Beach casualty rate on June 6th demands a specific technical note that most documentary treatments skip over. The Allied pre-landing fire support, the naval bombardment, and the bombing by the 8th Air Force was planned to suppress the German beach defenses in the critical minutes before the landing craft reached the shore. The naval bombardment delivered approximately 7,000 tons of shells onto German coastal positions in a concentrated period before the assault. The bomber attack, however, due to cloud cover over the beach on the morning of June 6th, dropped the majority of its bomb load miles inland, missing the beach defenses almost entirely. The bombers had delayed their release by several seconds to avoid hitting the landing craft below, and in the conditions of that morning, those seconds translated to miles of error. 6 German 88mm positions that were not neutralized by the pre-landing bombardment were specifically identified in post-battle analysis as responsible for the majority of American armored and personnel losses in the first 2 hours at Omaha. All 6 of those positions are identifiable on the Schaeff fire plan. They were in the plan. They weren't hit. I find that the D-Day story, told from the German side, is fundamentally a story about the consequences of poor institutional design under pressure. The structural incompatibilities in the German command arrangement, the Rommel-Rundstedt strategic disagreement, the Hitler Reserve, the absence of any mechanism for resolving command disputes in real time, were visible before the invasion. Every structural feature that made the German response on June 6th inadequate was present in the pre-invasion planning record. The Germans weren't surprised by what happened. They were defeated partly by a system of command that they themselves had constructed, that they had not resolved, and that, on the day, operated exactly as its contradictions predicted it would. Chapter 15. The Bomb Under the Table. Germany tries to save itself. This chapter covers events already introduced in Chapter 13 in their broader context. Here, the focus narrows to the specific hours of July 20th and the months that followed, because it is in the operational detail of those hours and in the institutional consequences of their failure that the history's most important questions become sharpest. Let me be direct about the scale question first. The July 20th plot's moral significance is enormous. Its actual impact on the course of the war was minimal. The bomb detonated. Hitler survived. Germany fought for 10 more months. Those 10 months cost millions of lives. The distance between the moral importance of the act and its strategic consequence is not a reason to diminish either. It's a reason to hold them separately and honestly. Klaus von Stauffenberg armed the explosive using a pair of pliers, working with the fingers remaining to him on his left hand in an anteroom adjacent to the briefing space, with approximately 10 minutes available before he was expected inside. He had 2 blocks of explosive. He armed one. A colleague appeared at the door before he could arm the second. The unarmed bomb remained in his briefcase and was driven with him to the airfield when he left the Wolf's Lair after the detonation, carried unknowingly back to Berlin. The difference between one armed block and 2 armed blocks in the concrete bunker that normally housed such conferences and would have housed this one, had the day not been warm enough to move the meeting to a wooden structure, was the difference between certain death and the survivable wound Hitler received. The second unarmed bomb was not discovered by German investigators for days. The margin between the history we know and a different history is measurable in grams of explosive and degrees of temperature. The time pencil fuse Stauffenberg used was a British SOE-supplied device, a small glass vial of acid that, when crushed by an attached pliers mechanism, began corroding a metal wire restraining a spring-loaded striker. When the acid ate through the wire, the striker fired into the detonator. The delay was chemically determined by acid concentration and temperature. The Wolf's Lair in July was warm. Estimates suggest temperatures in the conference hut were above 20 degrees Celsius. At warmer temperatures, the acid works faster, shortening the delay. Stauffenberg had roughly 10 minutes between arming the device and leaving the room, and the explosion occurred at approximately the interval he had calculated. Had the meeting remained in the concrete bunker, air-conditioned, cooler, the fuse delay might have been slightly longer, and the blast would have been fully contained by concrete rather than dispersed through wood. The physics of the fuse mechanism, operating at the temperature of a warm summer briefing room in East Prussia, is one of the specific technical determinants of the war's final year. In Berlin, the operational failure of the conspiracy's post-assassination phase is a subject historians have examined with the forensic attention it deserves. The conspirators had spent months refining the Valkyrie plan, the reserve army mobilization orders that would, once Hitler was dead, allow them to secure Berlin and key communication centers before the SS could respond. The plan was detailed and professionally constructed. What it lacked was a mechanism for operating under uncertainty, for committing to action before absolute confirmation of Hitler's death arrived. The 3 hours between the explosion and the beginning of meaningful Valkyrie signals from the Bendler block represent the conspiracy's operational center of gravity. When Stauffenberg landed at Berlin's Rangsdorf airfield and telephoned the Bendler block to confirm the explosion, the conspirators there had been receiving contradictory signals. Some initial reports indicated Hitler was dead. Later signals indicated he might be alive. The plan required a dead Hitler. The conspirators waited for certainty that was never going to come in sufficient time. By roughly 5:30 in the afternoon, it was clear to most of them that the operation had failed. By midnight, the Bendler block itself was under SS control. The aftermath consumed the Wehrmacht's senior officer corps with a thoroughness that crippled Germany's remaining military capacity in ways historians still argue about quantifying. Approximately 7,000 people were arrested in the months following July 20th. Approximately 200 were executed, but the full institutional cost extended far beyond the executed and the imprisoned. Senior officers who had no connection to the conspiracy were investigated, placed under surveillance, or removed from command because someone in the interrogation chain mentioned their name. The atmosphere of mutual suspicion within the Wehrmacht's senior leadership in the autumn and winter of 1944, documented in multiple post-war accounts and, indirectly, in the increasingly erratic command decisions of those months is not separable from the July 20th aftermath. A military organization conducting a desperate defensive war simultaneously being used as a hunting ground by the Gestapo is an organization operating at reduced institutional function. The People's Court proceedings against the conspirators were filmed at Hitler's order, and the footage was distributed. Freisler presided, screaming. The defendants stood in oversized clothes, stripped of their belts and military decorations, designed to appear diminished before the cameras. Several of the defendants, by multiple accounts, conducted themselves with remarkable dignity against every structural effort to deny them that dignity. The film was shown to Wehrmacht officer audiences in part as a warning. Freisler was killed on the 3rd of February, 1945, when American bombs struck the People's Court building during a session. He had, by various accounts, declined to take shelter. The contrast between his death and the deaths of the men he had condemned isn't something history arranged for dramatic effect. It's just what happened. What July 20th ultimately demonstrated, in its failure as much as its attempt, was the absence of any remaining mechanism within the Third Reich for the system to correct itself short of physical military defeat. Every institution that might have served as a check, the judiciary, the press, the political parties, the trade unions, had been dismantled or corrupted in the years between 1933 and 1935. The military, which had briefly retained a degree of institutional independence, had been further neutered after July 20th. Post-plot, military orders required SS countersignature, and intelligence operations were subjected to RSHA oversight. A totalitarian state, by the time it is fully consolidated, has removed the institutional capacity for self-correction by design. The July 20th conspirators were trying to reintroduce that capacity from the outside of a system specifically built to prevent it. That they came as close as they did, the thickness of a table leg away from genuine success, says something about their courage. That they failed says something about the system's design. Chapter 16, Götterdämmerung, the empire eating itself. Hold 4 documents in mind simultaneously. The first, a Berlin anti-aircraft command report, noting that the city had received its 300th air raid. The second, a Reichsbahn transport schedule for deportation trains still running to Auschwitz. The third, a Wehrmacht 9th Army report on the state of Oder River defences. The fourth, a Führer bunker construction invoice for additional waterproofing of the underground complex. These 4 documents were generated on or around the same date in the late autumn of 1944. They existed simultaneously. 4 entirely different versions of Germany's reality, produced by 4 different bureaucratic systems, none of them quite inhabiting the same factual universe. The Air Command was counting raids. The railway was scheduling transports. The army was trying to hold a river line with inadequate forces. The bunker was being made more watertight. All of this was Germany in the winter of 1944 to 45. The final year of the Third Reich is sometimes described as a collapse. It wasn't a collapse exactly. It was a prolonged, multi-directional, simultaneous failure, occurring at different speeds across different systems: military, industrial, administrative, social, held together past the point of any rational expectation by a combination of fear, ideology, institutional inertia, and the specific disinclination of the regime's leadership to acknowledge what the evidence was saying. This is the important distinction. The Third Reich, in its last year, wasn't failing, despite its leadership's best efforts. It was failing partly because its leadership had designed a system in which acknowledging failure was more dangerous than continuing into catastrophe. Every institutional mechanism for saying stop had been destroyed. What remained was motion in a fixed direction, until the physical obstacle, the Allied armies from west and east, made motion impossible. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive of December of 1944, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, committed Germany's last major operational armoured reserve to a counter-offensive, whose stated goal was the recapture of the Belgian port of Antwerp, roughly 160 kilometres from the German start line. The operation involved approximately 600 tanks and nearly 200,000 men. OKW planning documents prepared before the offensive's launch contained internal assessments describing the operational objective as unlikely given current fuel reserves. The offensive launched on the 16th of December anyway. Kampfgruppe Pieper, the SS armoured spearhead tasked with the deepest penetration, had been allocated fuel for approximately 150 kilometres of advance. The terrain and fighting conditions consumed that allocation in under 90 kilometres. By the 20th of December, Pieper's force was surrounded, essentially out of fuel, and by the 23rd of December, conducting a breakout on foot, abandoning its vehicles. Germany's last armoured reserve had been committed to an offensive that its own planners had documented as underfueled before it began, and it had run out of fuel, roughly 60 kilometres short of its first major objective. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia, established by decree on the 25th of September 1944, drafted males between the ages of 16 and 60, not already serving in the regular military. By the winter of 1944 to 45, Volkssturm units were being formed and committed to combat in Berlin and along the Oder line with approximately 2 weeks of training, armed primarily with the Panzerfaust 60, the disposable anti-tank weapon with an effective range of 60 meters and an armor penetration capability of approximately 200 millimeters. The Panzerfaust 60's shaped charge warhead worked on the Monroe effect, the same physical principle underlying modern rocket-propelled grenades, focusing the explosive force through a metal-lined cavity into a concentrated penetrating jet. It was genuinely effective against armor at close range. It was a weapon designed for trained soldiers in prepared defensive positions, not for 16-year-old boys given 2 weeks of instruction and sent to hold river crossings against armored Soviet assault formations. The Volkssturm records of specific Berlin units formed in January of 1945 show average ages significantly above 40. The casualty rates are in the records. The bombing of Dresden on the 13th to 15th of February 1945 remains one of the war's most contested events. Contested not in the sense that the bombings occurred, but in the sense that the death toll has been argued over, inflated, revised, and weaponized for political purposes across 8 decades. Nazi propaganda immediately claimed figures of 200,000 dead, which were false. Post-war West German estimates varied widely. The Dresden Historical Commission, established by the city itself and presenting its final findings in 2010 after more than 5 years of archival research, concluded that the raids killed between 22,700 and 25,000 people. That number, 22,000 to 25,000, does not need inflation to be a catastrophe. The inflation itself is a historical document. The Nazi propaganda apparatus, in its final months, was still generating false statistics for political consumption. Dresden's genuine suffering has been obscured for decades by the false numbers placed over it. Soviet Operation Vistula Oder launched on the 12th of January 1945. In 23 days, Soviet forces advanced over 500 kilometers. the fastest sustained major advance on any front in the entire war. The Wehrmacht's Eastern Front reports from this period, held in the Bundesarchiv, are remarkable in their growing textual fragmentation. The operational military prose that characterized German war diary entries in 1941 and 42, precise, measured, technically detailed, gives way by January of 1945 to something that reads differently, shorter, more provisional, increasingly written in the passive voice as though agency itself has become hard to locate. Units that engaged and repelled in 1941 attempted to hold and were forced to withdraw in January of 1945. The language of a military organization is itself a barometer of institutional confidence. Albert Speer's memorandum to Hitler in March of 1945 stated plainly that the German economy would effectively cease to function within weeks. This was not Speer's first such assessment. He had been compiling increasingly grim economic projections since the autumn of 1944, each one more specific about the timeline of industrial collapse. Hitler received this March memorandum. He acknowledged it. He issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all industrial, military, and infrastructure assets remaining in Germany, rather than allow them to fall into Allied hands. Speer, in one of the clearest post-war documented instances of genuine resistance within the regime's inner circle, spent the final weeks of the war attempting to circumvent this order, persuading local commanders not to execute demolitions. The March Memorandum and the Nero Decree together reveal something specific about the regime's final psychology. It had moved beyond any calculation of Germany's interests and into something closer to a commitment to destruction as an end in itself. The extermination machinery ran until remarkably late. The Auschwitz-Birkenau complex was not evacuated until January of 1945, when the sound of Soviet artillery was audible from the camp. The crematoria were demolished, evidence destruction. She documented in the timing discrepancy between SS records and survivor accounts. Somewhere in the autumn of 1944, the deportation trains had continued running into the summer and autumn of that year, even as the Reich's military situation deteriorated irreversibly on every front. In the war's final year, there were documented instances where SS deportation requirements competed for railway capacity with Wehrmacht ammunition resupply, and where, on certain routes, on certain days, the deportations took priority. This is not a small fact. It establishes a hierarchy of institutional priority that says something specific about what the regime considered essential to its mission, separate from, and in some cases, at the expense of military survival. By April of 1945, Hitler was in the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin. He was issuing orders to army formations that no longer existed, moving divisions on maps that bore no relationship to the actual positions of the fragmenting front. The accounts of those final weeks, from the testimonies of bunker staff collected by British intelligence officers in the months immediately after the war and published in accounts like Hugh Trevor Roper's, describe a man physically deteriorated, conducting briefings with increasingly tenuous contact with operational reality, still dictating while Soviet artillery could be heard overhead. Eva Braun had arrived on the 15th of April. On the 28th, Hitler and Braun were married in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. On the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by his own hand. The Third Reich outlasted him by 7 days. Chapter 17, The Ruins and the Reckoning. The building at Behrenschanzstraße 72 in Nuremberg was chosen for a specific and entirely practical reason. It was mostly intact. The city around it was not. American bombing surveys conducted after Germany's surrender estimated that Nuremberg, the city of the Nazi Party rallies, the city that gave its name to the racial laws, the city whose medieval streets and square had been appropriated as the physical backdrop of the regime's mythology, was approximately 90% destroyed. The Palace of Justice had survived. So justice convened in the ruins of what the regime had built, in the only building left standing that was large enough to hold an international tribunal. There is something in that physical fact. The courthouse surrounded by rubble, hearing arguments about what had been done and by whom in the language of law, while the evidence of the doing lay in fragments all around it, that requires no editorial commentary. The 8th of May, 1945, is the date most commonly given for Germany's surrender. The reality is slightly more complicated. The formal capitulation was signed twice. First at Reims, France, on the 7th of May, by General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, in the presence of Western Allied and Soviet representatives. The Soviets considered this signing preliminary and insisted on a second, definitive ceremony, conducted at Berlin-Karlshorst on the night of the 8th of May, chaired by Marshal Zhukov, with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signing for Germany. The two ceremonies produced documents with slightly different procedural language that both nations considered the legally binding act of surrender. The Western Allies had their date. The Soviets had theirs. This wasn't a diplomatic quirk. It reflected genuinely different understandings of what the war's ending meant and who had the authority to formalize it. For the Soviet Union, which had suffered between 26 and 27 million dead, the Karlshorst ceremony was the only one that mattered. The physical reality of Germany in May of 1945 is not fully captured by the word defeat. Approximately 3.5 million German homes had been destroyed by bombing. An estimated 500,000 German civilians had been killed in Allied air raids. The country east of the Elbe was under Soviet occupation, its population facing the immediate consequences of a war that had been prosecuted with particular ruthlessness on the Eastern Front, and that was now, in its final months, generating reciprocal violence of extraordinary scope. Approximately 14 million ethnic Germans were in the process of being expelled from Eastern Europe, from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Baltic states, in what was, by population scale, the largest forced population transfer in European history. These expellees arrived in a Germany with no functioning administration, destroyed infrastructure, and food supplies insufficient to sustain the existing population. The humanitarian disaster of the immediate post-war period in Germany is a chapter that often disappears from the larger narrative of victory and liberation. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg tried 22 major war criminals between November of 1945 and October of 1946. 19 were found guilty, 12 were sentenced to death. The trials were simultaneously the most important achievement in international criminal law in the history of modern civilization, and a proceeding with genuine structural limitations that its architects acknowledged and that its critics, then and since, have identified accurately. The tribunal was created by the victorious powers and applied legal standards, particularly the charge of crimes against peace, prosecuting the planning and waging of aggressive war that had not existed in codified international law before the tribunal created them. The retroactive application of law was criticized by defense counsel at the time and by legal scholars since. The charter was nonetheless an extraordinary act of institutional innovation. It articulated for the first time in binding international legal form The principle that crimes so severe they violate the basic conditions of human existence cannot be sheltered behind the sovereignty of any state, and that individuals, not merely states, can be held criminally responsible for acts committed under state authority. Hermann Göring's performance at Nuremberg is worth examining as a primary source in its own right. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged evidence, maintained consistent positions under extended questioning from prosecutors from 4 nations, and in the last weeks before his execution, from which he escaped by taking a cyanide capsule, gave no visible indication of remorse. His trial testimony is documented. His claim to have been unaware of the systematic murder of millions is directly contradicted by documents introduced as evidence in his own trial, including his own signatures on administrative orders. The prosecution had no difficulty establishing what he did and when. The more difficult question, what he understood and felt about what he did, is one that the trial record answers less clearly, and that historians have been arguing about since. Göring took the cyanide on the 15th of October, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution. Who supplied it remains, to this day, one of Nuremberg's unresolved mysteries. What Nuremberg did not reach is a fact that the post-war German justice authorities eventually attempted to quantify. German prosecutors estimated, in the course of their own investigations across the following decades, that approximately 50,000 individuals were implicated by documentary evidence in war crimes who were never the subject of any judicial proceeding. The desk killers, the railway administrators, the census officials, the insurance adjusters, the municipal bureaucrats who processed Aryanization transfers, were largely not tried. Many of them resumed their professional lives. The railway officials who booked deportation trains worked for the post-war Deutsche Bundesbahn. The insurance company clerks returned to insurance. The census officials who administered racial classification went back to census work. This isn't a failure that the Nuremberg trials can be blamed for. The scale of administrative participation in the Holocaust was simply too vast for any judicial process to encompass. But the consequence is that the legal reckoning of the post-war decades addressed the visible apex of a system whose base remained largely untouched. The concept of crimes against humanity, first formally codified in Article 6 of the Nuremberg Charter, was, in 1945, genuinely new legal territory. The idea that an act could violate international law, regardless of whether it violated the domestic law of the state that committed it, and that individuals could be held criminally responsible for such acts, even when acting under state authority, had no solid precedent in international law before the Charter was drafted. This single legal innovation, clarified, extended, and formalized over the following decades, became the foundation for the Genocide Convention of 1948, the subsequent UN human rights framework, the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s, and the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court in 1998. The ICC, which came into force in 2002, now exercises jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed by nationals of its member states or on their territory. It is the direct institutional descendant of what 15 lawyers and 4 national governments tried to construct in the ruins of Nuremberg in the autumn of 1945. Adolf Eichmann reached Argentina in 1950 using a Vatican-facilitated escape network known as the Rat Lines that moved former Nazi officials and war criminals through Italy and into South America. He lived in Buenos Aires under a false name for a decade, working at a Volkswagen plant in a suburb of the city. The Mossad had been searching for him since the war. A tip from a Holocaust survivor, who believed he had seen Eichmann in Buenos Aires, put Israeli intelligence on his trail. On the 11th of May, 1960, Mossad agents abducted Eichmann near his home in San Fernando, Buenos Aires, and flew him to Israel on an El Al aircraft. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961, convicted on 15 counts including crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity, and executed on the 31st of May, 1962. He is the only person ever executed in the state of Israel under a civilian court sentence. His trial, which Hannah Arendt covered for The New Yorker and which produced her formulation of the banality of evil, still debated by scholars, is, in some ways, the trial that Nuremberg didn't quite manage to conduct. The trial of the administrator, the desk killer, the man whose crime was organization rather than direct action, and who argued that the distinction mattered. I want to end with something I find genuinely unresolvable, because the unresolvability is the honest final note. We know, with documentary precision, how this happened. We know who signed what, who built what, who scheduled what. We have the Wannsee Protocol. We have the Reichsbank ledgers. We have the railway invoices. We have the Einsatzgruppen reports. We have more primary source documentation of the Holocaust and the Nazi state than we have for almost any comparable catastrophe in history. The archive is extraordinary in its completeness, and yet the knowledge preserved in that archive has not been sufficient in the 8 decades since to prevent subsequent genocides. Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. The names accumulate. The archive grows. The frameworks of international law developed at Nuremberg are being applied, should imperfectly and incompletely, to 21st century atrocities, by an international criminal court whose jurisdiction is contested by several of the world's most powerful states. The project that Nuremberg began, universal accountability for crimes against humanity, is ongoing, embattled, and unfinished. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but the alternative, pretending the reckoning is complete, would be a failure of exactly the kind of honesty that the documentary record demands. The 12 years of the Third Reich killed, by the most careful available accounting, approximately 6 million Jews, 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, approximately 1.8 million non-Jewish Polish civilians, 500,000 Roma, 270,000 people murdered under the T4 disability program, and hundreds of thousands of political prisoners, gay men, and others. The regime designated as threats or subhumans. The military dead across all nations who fought in the war. It started German, Soviet, British, American, Chinese, and dozens more. Add tens of millions. The Soviet Union alone lost between 26 and 27 million people in total. These numbers are so large they resist comprehension. I won't pretend to make them comprehensible. What they are, at the level this archive can reach, is a census of an absence, a counting of what was deliberately and systematically removed from the world by a state that functioned from the first weeks of 1933 to the last hours of April 1945, with the bureaucratic efficiency of a well-organized modern institution, applying the full resources of a modern European civilization to the project of its own catastrophe. That is the record. The archive holds it, and the archive, the Bundesarchiv, the Arolsen Archives, Yad Vashem, the National Archives in Washington, the documents at the US HMM, the files in Moscow that are still being opened decades after the war, keeps demanding that we go back and read it more carefully, more completely, and more honestly than we have done before. Not because the past can be changed, because the present is still being made by people who are deciding right now what kind of institutions to build, what kind of legal frameworks to sustain, and whether the reckoning that began at Nuremberg in 1945 deserves to continue. The answer is yes. The record says so plainly. In the language of every document in every archive this project has touched,